I wasn't supposed to be on this crew. Originally, I was scheduled to join the survey vessel Nova Echo 2 weeks later for a job off the Azores. But a last-minute cancellation by another technician meant I got bumped up. They flew me in on short notice, shoved a thick operations binder into my arms, and told me, read the highlighted pages before we dive. I didn't get a chance to unpack before we were already 40 miles offshore. I've worked deep-sea telecom for 8 years now, spent more time in decompression than some Navy divers. I've done dives in the Baltic, the Caribbean Trench, even that cursed patch off the Indian coast we call the breathing pit. I've seen strange things at the ocean's floor, shimmering anomalies, deep-sea fauna that shouldn't exist, entire sunken cities lost to maps. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what I found beneath the North Atlantic. This job was different. We weren't repairing a cable. We were reconnecting some ancient line originally laid in the 1950s that had been dormant for decades. Someone somewhere had paid top dollar to reactivate it. Our job was to descend, locate the junction point, and manually reconnect it to a new relay node. Simple enough. We were just supposed to be the hands. The binder I was handed had rules, not protocols. Rules, printed in red ink, right between emergency procedures and pressure equalization diagrams. Rules for Operation Echo Dusk Protocol for cable line ZN47. Do not attempt to trace where the cable originates. If you see lights in the trench, turn off your suit's headlamp immediately. If you hear voices through your comm system, do not respond, even if it uses your name. The relay node will accept your presence before it opens. Wait until it pulses blue. Once the connection is made, ascend within 7 minutes. If unable to ascend, break the mirror capsule. I asked the crew about the list. The engineer who handed me the binder, Becker, just smiled and said, "Don't worry about it. It's protocol from upstairs. We've done this run once before. You follow the rules, you come back up." He didn't elaborate. The dive itself was uneventful at first. The ROV scouted ahead, lights scanning the endless seabed like ghostly searchlights. We descended in the bell to about 4,300 meters, a ridiculous depth for a manned operation, but nothing our suits and systems couldn't handle. Down there, in the inky cold, everything feels dead. Time doesn't pass the same. Your thoughts slow down. The pressure wraps around your skull like a tightening glove. But when I stepped out of the dive bell and my boots sank into that black sediment, something was off. The cable was massive, at least a meter thick, and made of a material I'd never seen. It pulsed faintly, an almost imperceptible glow like bioluminescence. When I ran my glove over it, I felt a hum. Not electric, not mechanical, organic, like touching the back of a sleeping animal. I followed the length of it to the relay node, some coffin-sized box half buried in the sand, covered in barnacle-like growths and something that looked like veins. I waited for the blue pulse, per the rules. 10 seconds, then 20. Just when I was about to radio in, the node breathed. That's the only way I can describe it. It inhaled, its panels expanding outward like a ribcage. And then it pulsed blue. I knelt, opened my toolkit, and began the reconnect procedure. That's when the lights started. At first I thought they were from the submersible above, reflections maybe, or bioluminescent plankton reacting to our equipment. But they moved in patterns. Shapes. Circles, then triangles, then spirals. Deliberate, like they were watching me, or signaling. I flicked off my headlamp. The lights remained. That's when I broke Rule 1. I wasn't trying to be curious. I just wanted to orient myself, see if the lights were being reflected from something on the seafloor. I turned and let my eyes trace the cable backward toward its origin. That's when I saw the trench. No map had shown it. It wasn't on the sonar, but there it was, a jagged scar in the seabed, maybe 30 meters wide, blacker than the water itself. The cable descended into it, disappearing into nothingness. And there was something inside it. I saw movement. Not fish, not eels. Something taller, human-shaped. They stood at the edge of the trench, just watching. Dozens of them. No suits, no lights. Just silhouettes in the water, staring upward with what I could feel, not see, but feel were hollow eyes. That's when the comms crackled. Jude, my name, clear as day. But it wasn't Becker. It wasn't anyone from the crew. The voice was soft, feminine, familiar. It sounded like my sister who died when I was 10. I gritted my teeth and focused on the cable, locking the relay node. My gloves trembled, not from fear, but from the voice, because it was saying things only she could have known. Don't forget the time we got locked in the basement. You cried until Mom found us. I bit my lip. Don't respond. I remembered the rule. The node pulsed white, signaling the connection was complete. I should have ascended. I didn't, because I saw something in the corner of my eye, my sister, or something that looked like her, floating just outside the trench in a dress she hadn't worn since the day of her funeral. I reached for the mirror capsule strapped to my suit. Then the others moved. The human-like figures began crawling upward from the trench edge. They didn't swim. They climbed, digging long fingers into the seabed, pulling themselves forward with jerking, unnatural motions. Their heads cocked sideways, their mouths too wide, too round. I'd seen those mouths before, in deep-sea fish that live in pitch black, mouths that unhinge to devour prey whole. I turned and ran, if you can call it that, underwater. Kicked off the seafloor, pushing hard toward the bell. That's when the cable pulsed red. Everything stopped. A low hum rang through my suit, vibrating not in the water, but in me. My bones ached. My teeth felt loose. And then the voice came again, louder this time, all around me. Stay. My dive computer began to glitch, numbers warping, countdown timers spiraling. The oxygen gauge blinked empty, then full, then empty again. Alarms that didn't exist in the manual screamed in my ears. I pulled the mirror capsule from my belt. You don't want to know what it is. They don't explain it in the binder, just that it's a fail-safe. That when all else fails, break the capsule. I did. There was a flash, a sharp, mirror-like burst of silver light that didn't illuminate anything, but reflected everything. I saw myself, dozens of me, trapped in infinite water, screaming. And then I was in the bell. I don't remember getting back in. 1 second, I was surrounded by the trench, the voices, the lights, and the next, I was slumped in the pressurized bell, bleeding from my nose, the mirror capsule in pieces at my feet. I was the only one who went down, but I wasn't the only one who came back up. The crew won't say anything. Becker avoids me now. When I try to bring it up, they just nod and change the subject. I check the camera footage from the dive. It's blank, completely blacked out from the moment I reached the cable. But something's different about the ship. The air smells wrong. Metallic. The kind of scent you get from leaving batteries in your mouth too long. And sometimes, at night, I hear scratching at the hull, like fingernails, trying to find a way back in. Last night, I found a message written on the condensation of my cabin mirror. We accepted you. I'm scheduled for a psych eval tomorrow, but I already know how it'll go. I'll smile, play along, say I'm just tired. But the truth is, I'm not sure I came back alone, and I'm not sure I ever left.
I still remember the first time I set foot in the specialized overnight unit of our urban hospital, a labyrinth of quiet hallways and muted tones that, on the surface, appeared benign. I was a resident doctor, freshly assigned to observing care for long-term patients who occupied rooms that lay in the unspoken margins of the hospital. There was an unanticipated melancholy in that unit, a heavy silence that went beyond the ordinary exhaustion of night shifts. At first, I chalked it up to the loneliness of the late hours and the weary resignation of patients nearing the ends of their journeys. But it didn't take long for me to sense that something far more profound was at work here, a mystery that seemed to seep into the very walls of the building. My nights began with the relentless hum of machines and the steady, occasional beep of a monitor registering a life quietly ticking on. The lights were dimmed to a comforting level, yet in that semi-darkness, the halls took on a surreal quality. At times, I felt as if I were walking through the corridors of a memory rather than a living institution, as if every footstep echoed the lost voices of those long past. I remember passing by an old, slightly tarnished mirror in the nurse's station and catching a glimpse of a shadow that wasn't entirely my own, a fleeting, unaccountable presence that left me unsettled long after I had resumed my rounds. As the nights progressed, the unit began to reveal subtle signs of an unseen history. I first noticed it on a humid summer night when the hum of the air conditioning was abruptly replaced by a series of soft murmurs. I was reviewing patient files near a window when a voice, barely a whisper, murmured my name. I spun around quickly, heart hammering in my chest, only to find the room empty, save for the flickering light of my desk lamp. That night, sleep was elusive, chased away by the persistent feeling that the very air was charged with unspoken secrets. I tried to convince myself that it had to be the product of exhaustion or a trick of acoustics, but the feeling grew stronger with each passing shift. I began to notice other inexplicable occurrences. The old clock in the corridor inexplicably stopped at precisely 3:07 a.m. on several nights. The temperature would drop suddenly in an empty room, and I found several old personal mementos, a locket, a faded handkerchief, a name engraved on a piece of worn-out wood, appearing in places where they shouldn't be. It was as if remnants of the past were making their silent, spectral return. Every now and then, while making my routine rounds, I would catch a glimpse of a figure in the corner of my eye, a hazy outline of a person whose presence stirred both sorrow and curiosity. I soon deduced that these encounters weren't random illusions cast by my tired mind, but the deliberate, albeit cryptic, echoing of a story that had long ago been silenced by the cold indifference of a broken system. One night, after an exhausting shift filled with fleeting apparitions and disembodied voices, I found solace in the quiet solitude of the administrative corridor. I huddled over a collection of old patient files, yellowed and nearly worn to nothingness, trying to piece together the puzzle of the unit's past. What I unearthed was a series of tragic narratives, individual lives that had faded from institutional memory without so much as a proper farewell. There was Mrs. Aldridge, a woman whose gentle smile belied the deep sadness of her final days. Mr. Hargrove, whose eyes once sparkled with dreams now permanently closed, and many other souls whose names barely left a trace in the modern records. As I read each story, I felt their silent voices merging into one collective whisper, an echo that seemed to saturate every corner of the unit. I began to wonder if the murmurs I heard were not mere products of my imagination, but rather the accumulated grief and regret of all those forgotten by time. Then, on an unusually heavy night, I experienced the phenomenon that defied every rational explanation I had clung to so far. After a long day filled with meticulous charting and brief, anxious conversations with patients and their family members, I sat alone in one of the subdued waiting areas between treatment zones. I found myself enveloped by an inexplicable melancholy, as if I had stepped into someone else's private memory. In the distance, the soft strains of what sounded like a piano playing a sorrowful melody reached me, a tune so evocative that it brought tears to my eyes. I followed the sound with a mix of dread and desperate curiosity, passing through corridors that seemed to stretch on far longer than I remembered. At the source, I discovered nothing more than a spare break room with peeling wallpaper and a solitary, dusty window. Yet, as I lingered there, the haunting melody grew louder, each note resonating with the heartbeat of long-forgotten souls. I soon became convinced that the music was not produced by any ordinary means. It was as if the walls themselves were singing in a language of loss, a lament for the lives that had passed by unnoticed. In the following weeks, the mysterious occurrences escalated, and so did the intensity of my introspection. The voices in the unit grew bolder in their insistence that I needed to remember, to acknowledge something that had been buried beneath years of forgetfulness and negligence. I started to document every occurrence meticulously, logging every whisper, temperature drop, and shadow that moved in a way that defied the predictable rhythms of the night. What began as academic curiosity slowly transformed into an obsession, a need to unravel the hidden tapestry woven into the fabric of the hospital's history. I reached out to some of the long-standing nurses and administrative staff who had worked through multiple eras of the institution. Their recollections were as fragmented as they were vivid, stories of patients lost in bureaucratic limbo, of care deferred until it was too late, and of quiet acts of heroism buried beneath the avalanche of modern technology. In hushed conversations during breaks, they recounted events that were seldom spoken of in the harsh light of day. Their words painted a picture of a healthcare system that, in its relentless pursuit of efficiency and sanitized professionalism, had inadvertently discarded the most vulnerable among us. These conversations, often laden with the raw emotion of personal loss, were as compelling as the spectral hints that visited me during my shifts. One evening, as I was completing my rounds with a growing sense of purpose and trepidation, I encountered a moment of surreal confrontation that would forever alter my perspective on what I had been witnessing. I was returning from a particularly long examination of a patient in a dimly lit room, where I had found evidence of neglect hidden beneath layers of bureaucracy and sorrow, when I noticed a figure standing motionless by the far end of the corridor. At first, it looked like one of the elderly patients, but as I moved closer, I realized that this figure did not belong to any living body I knew. The person was translucent, dressed in clothing reminiscent of a bygone era, with eyes that seemed to flicker with both hope and despair. In that split second, the weight of countless untold stories pressed down on me, and I recognized with a jolt that I was face to face with a spirit tethered to these grounds. I recalled the name of a patient I had read about in one of the old files, a young woman who had succumbed to a tragic illness, her pain and pleas stifled by the sterile walls of the hospital. As I reached out with trembling fingers, the apparition slowly dissipated, leaving behind a lingering chill and a profound sense of responsibility. I felt as though that ghostly presence had entrusted me with this sacred duty of bearing witness to the truths that had been hidden away. In the days that followed this encounter, the unit seemed to hum with an almost imperceptible urgency. The wind in the ventilation ducts sounded almost like soft sighs, and the overhead lights cast flickering patterns that danced on the walls like ephemeral memories. Every detail, every sensation, took on a heightened significance as I began to piece together not just the individual narratives, but a broader tapestry of systemic indifference and sorrow. I started to believe that the nocturnal phenomena were a collective outcry, a desperate attempt by forgotten souls to reclaim their rightful memory, to force the living to face the cost of neglect that they had so comfortably absorbed. I would sometimes find myself sitting quietly in a corner, notebooks open and pen trembling in hand, trying to capture the essence of those fleeting moments. Each scribbled note and hastily recorded observation felt like a plea for the past to be acknowledged and for the present to learn from the silent errors of history. Gradually, the unit revealed not just its ghosts, but also the hidden intricacies of its own existence. One humid night, while I was examining a file that detailed the final hours of a patient whose story had been buried under layers of official reports, I noticed a detail that sent shivers down my spine. The records hinted at a network of oversights where critical warnings were drowned out by the clamor of modernity and the relentless pursuit of statistical success. It became painfully clear that the tragic fates of many patients were not isolated incidents, but part of a broader pattern, a pattern of systemic abandonment and clinical detachment. Even as I documented these findings, an eerie silence would descend on the ward as though the very building was holding its breath in anticipation of the truth being laid bare. I recalled nights when, in the midst of routine tasks, I would suddenly feel a burning awareness of eyes upon me, an invisible audience, as if the collective soul of the unit were silently judging my every step. One particularly long night remains seared into my memory. After hours of painstaking work cataloging discrepancies in patient records, I finally decided to step out for a brief respite. The corridors were unusually quiet, bathed in a ghostly light that blurred the line between shadow and substance. I wandered aimlessly, my thoughts heavy with the weight of the uncovered truths, when I came upon an old nurse's station that had been abandoned for years. There, amidst dusty instruments and long-forgotten files, I discovered a small drawer containing a bundle of handwritten letters. Each letter was addressed in careful, looping script, bearing the names of patients whose lives had been shortened by negligence, and each contained a desperate plea for accountability. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, reading every word until the anguished cries and silent promises of these letters intertwined with the quiet rhythm of the night. The documents served not only as a record of past misfortunes, but as a tangible connection to the souls who had once wandered these halls, their voices now echoing in the footsteps of a resident doctor determined to carry their message forward. Over the following weeks, the spectral manifestations grew more deliberate in their presence. I began to sense a duality in the experiences. On one level, there was the haunting melancholy of the unit, a palpable feeling of loss and regret that seemed to hang in the air. On another level, the encounters took on an almost interactive quality, as though the very essence of the past was attempting to communicate with me directly. I recall an instance when, during my routine checks, an old bedside clock began to chime softly at odd intervals. Every time it struck, I heard a fragment of a whisper, a single word carried on the wind, barely audible yet full of meaning. In one such moment, the word "remember" resonated deep within me, stirring emotions that I could no longer ignore. It was as if every creak of the floor, every soft flutter of a curtain, was a deliberate reminder that the past was demanding recognition. In the midst of these escalating mysteries, I found my work becoming more than a mere duty. It evolved into an impassioned quest for redemption. I began reaching out to the families of former patients, piecing together recollections that provided crucial insights into a history many had forgotten. Their grief was palpable, laced with the raw anger of loss, and yet it was tempered by the hope that our stories, when shared, could lead to change. I compiled a silent dossier, a mosaic of records, letters, recorded whispers, and my own eyewitness accounts, each piece a testament to the neglected souls of the unit. Every new discovery filled me with a searing determination that overrode the creeping dread of working alone in the dead of night. I found myself growing increasingly isolated as the relentless pace of my investigations took a toll on my emotional well-being. The hospital corridors no longer offered the transient refuge they once had. Instead, they now felt like the confines of an unseen prison, their edges lined with the specters of the past. There were nights when I would lie awake on the hard cot in the on-call room, the silence punctuated only by the distant sound of my own breathing. In those moments, my mind would replay the ethereal symphony of murmurs and half-formed words, the urgency of a long-dead voice trying to break through the dam of time. I questioned my own sanity, wondering if I had become so enmeshed in the mysteries of the night that I could no longer distinguish between the real and the spectral. But even as the psychological toll mounted, I could not turn away from the truth that beckoned from the shadows. There was a power in those echoes, a reminder that beneath the sterile facade of modern healthcare lay the beating hearts and unfinished stories of those who had been forgotten. It was a sobering realization that forced me to confront my own vulnerabilities. The silent toll of sleepless nights, the haunting weight of unspoken regrets, and the bitter realization that sometimes the most significant battles are fought not with scalpels and prescriptions, but with remembrance and accountability. One fateful night, after a particularly grueling shift that left me physically drained and emotionally raw, I found myself once again in the quiet solitude of the unit's central corridor. The atmosphere was thick with an almost tangible presence, and I knew instinctively that I was not alone. As I walked, the temperature around me began to drop gradually, and I could see my breath forming small clouds in the cold air. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a figure, a young woman whose translucent form radiated both an unyielding sorrow and a quiet, desperate plea for vindication. The sight of her, so vivid against the pallid light of the emergency fixtures, sent a shiver down my spine that I could not dispel. In that moment, with a mixture of empathy and determination, I silently promised that I would not allow her memory to fade into oblivion. I approached slowly, each step measured, driven by the conviction that I had been chosen to listen to those who could no longer speak for themselves. There, in that solitary moment beneath the flickering lights, I reached out as if to bridge the divide between our worlds. The figure seemed to regard me with an unfathomable depth, an intensity that conveyed not malice, but a profound sorrow and longing. I whispered reassurances into the heavy silence, promising to bear witness to her pain, to recognize the injustice that had confined her spirit to this endless night. It was a fleeting encounter, yet it resonated with the full force of an entire lifetime of untold stories. As she dissipated like a wisp of smoke in the cold air, I realized that my quest was no longer just about unraveling historical negligence. It was about offering solace, about mending the fractured tapestry of memory with the thread of empathy and accountability. In the weeks and months that followed, the nocturnal visitation continued, each encounter reinforcing the singular mission that had consumed me. I became both caretaker and chronicler, a living repository of the unit's spectral whispers and the unfulfilled promises of the past. My nights, once marked by the clinical routine of examinations and medication rounds, had transformed into a relentless vigil in honor of those voices that could no longer be ignored. Even in moments when the weight of solitude threatened to overwhelm me, I found purpose in every recorded detail, every hushed conversation with a grieving family member, and every inexplicable phenomenon that defied the laws of nature. Now, as I recount these experiences, I am compelled by a quiet urgency to share this narrative with anyone who will listen, a reminder that within the heart of modern medicine lies a repository of suppressed histories, each waiting for its moment to be acknowledged. I continue my work in that dimly lit unit, where every shadow and whisper is an invitation to remember that the past is never dead. The echoes through the night speak to us in a language of sorrow and hope, urging us to bridge the gap between the overlooked and the celebrated, between neglect and recognition. In the relentless quiet of midnight, I have discovered a personal redemption, a solemn duty to honor those who have long been forgotten, whose final breaths were lost amid the clamor of efficiency and indifference. There is an ineffable beauty in the persistence of memory. Each spectral encounter, every softly uttered word in the silence of the corridors, stands as a testament to lives that mattered. I have learned that healing is not solely about treating the body, but also about healing the collective wounds that have accumulated over generations of oversight and sorrow. The unit, with its persistent gloom and enigmatic charm, has become a sanctuary for the voices that linger in its halls, a place where the past and present coexist in a fragile equilibrium. As I continue to traverse these lonely nights, my heart beats not just for the living souls under my care, but also for the ghostly remnants that serve as poignant reminders of what we must never let fade into silence. Tonight, as I wrap up another shift in this spectral space, I stand at the threshold of a window overlooking the city's restless lights. The cool night air carries with it whispers, a quiet chorus that speaks in the language of those left behind. I feel both vulnerable and empowered, a solitary witness tasked with preserving memories too precious to be lost. My pen is my instrument of remembrance, each stroke a promise to record the transient yet eternal symphony of echoes that define these hallowed halls. In the midst of desolation and neglect, I have found purpose. I have come to understand that the true essence of healing extends far beyond physical remedies. It requires an acknowledgement of every story, every tear shed in the silence, every whisper that begs to be heard. And so, I persist. I walk the corridors with a vigilance born of empathy, a commitment to the unseen and the unheard. I have discovered that the echoes through the night do more than haunt. They call us to remember, to reconcile, and to transform a legacy of neglect into one of collective healing. With each new night, I write my own chapter into the annals of this place, a small yet significant tribute to every life that has flickered in the dim light of these corridors. I will continue to listen, to document, and to remind the world that even in the quietest moments, the past persists, urging us to seek justice, compassion, and truth. In every cold draft, every softly murmured name, and every unexplained shadow, there lies a story waiting to be told, a story that, in its raw vulnerability, reshapes our understanding of both life and the silent mysteries that surround us. Thus, as the night deepens and I prepare to embrace another long, reflective shift, I carry with me the solemn assurance that no story, no matter how shrouded in sorrow, will be allowed to vanish without a trace. The echoes in the unit are not merely remnants of bygone eras. They are affirmations of existence, a call to all who can hear, to bear witness, and to heal the wounds of memory with the gentle light of remembrance. And in that light, there is hope, however fragile, that even the darkest nights can give birth to a new dawn of understanding and compassion. I've always been drawn to the twilight hours, the moment when the hospital's sterile hum transforms into something almost otherworldly, when the relentless beeping of monitors blends with a silence so profound it feels like a living entity breathing alongside you. I was a nurse on the night shift, an honor and a curse, and the midnight ward was my assigned domain one bitterly cold winter night. I still remember that shift as if it were yesterday, every detail engraved in my mind with an intensity that has yet to fade. It began like any other night, with a quiet hope of a calm shift, but what unfolded was a slow descent into dread, a journey through the limits of sanity where the living and the dead mingled in a blur of flashing lights and whispered secrets. That night, the hospital corridors were oddly deserted, the bustle of the day replaced with an unsettling quiet that made each step echo ominously. I made my rounds, clipboard in hand, my footsteps measured and deliberate. The old building had been renovated recently, its historical structure preserved but overlaid with modern updates. Yet, as I walked past the common areas, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The fluorescent lights seemed to struggle against the darkness, flickering in a way that blurred the boundaries between reality and the phantom world that I was about to encounter. I started my shift at the reception of the midnight ward, a section of the hospital that had been closed off for years due to its dark reputation. Rumors, whispered in the break room over lukewarm coffee, told tales of inexplicable events, mysterious patient disappearances, and an oppressive atmosphere that swallowed hope. I dismissed these stories as mere fodder for idle gossip, a twisted attempt by colleagues to make the long, lonely nights seem bearable, until I encountered what I can only describe as the inexplicable. As I checked the chart of a seemingly routine set of patients, a chill that had nothing to do with the winter seeped into my bones. In the reflection of the polished metal surfaces of an unused trolley, I thought I saw a figure, a pale, shadowy presence that disappeared as soon as I turned to look directly at it. My heart hammered, and for a fleeting moment, I wondered if exhaustion was playing tricks on me. But deep down, an instinct told me that the figure was real, that I had intruded into a domain where the rules of physics and logic held no sway. I tried to dismiss the sensation as nothing more than fatigue-induced hallucination, yet the air itself grew heavy with an inexplicable sense of foreboding as I continued down the deserted corridor. The real terror crept in later that night when I was assigned to check on a patient room that was strangely cold. a temperature that plummeted despite every attempt of the modern HVAC system to maintain a comfortable climate. The door creaked ominously as I stepped inside, and I was struck by an overwhelming feeling of being watched. In the dim glow of my flashlight, the room revealed nothing but the sterile bed and an assortment of dated medical equipment that seemed out of place in this state-of-the-art facility. As I turned to leave, a soft, almost inaudible whisper brushed against my ear, a sound that made my skin crawl and my blood run cold. It felt as though a long-forgotten sorrow was seeping into my very soul, a lament from someone who had once been here and was still echoing through the halls of the midnight ward. At first, I rationalized the experience as a trick of acoustics, a stray sound bouncing off the old walls, but the events of that night could not be explained away so easily. Over the next few shifts, I began to notice more signs that defied the mundane explanations that my rational mind desperately clung to. Objects would shift ever so slightly when no one was around, a door left ajar when it had been firmly closed minutes before, and a persistent, chilling draft that seemed to emanate from nowhere. The stark, white corridors would sometimes become painted with shadows that danced in shapes no human could create, and the persistent hum of the hospital would be pierced by a sorrowful melody, as if a hidden piano were playing in an abandoned room somewhere deep within the building. The turning point came one stormy night when the building was plunged into darkness by a power outage. The emergency lights kicked in, casting eerie, elongated shadows that made every corner of the midnight ward appear to harbor unspeakable secrets. I remember the storm outside, thunder roaring as though the heavens themselves were angry, rain lashing against the windows with a force that seemed to hammer home the reality of our isolation. With the corridors now illuminated only by the desperate glow of emergency fixtures, my every step felt like venturing deeper into a nightmare that had been brewing long before I ever set foot in that ward. It was then that I first encountered what I can only describe as the phantom patient. I was making my rounds near the far end of the corridor when I saw a figure standing motionless by a closed door. The outline was unmistakable, a patient in faded hospital attire, face obscured by shadows, standing in an unnatural stillness that defied logic. My pulse quickened, and I approached slowly, heart pounding in my ears. I called out softly, "Hello? Are you okay?" But the figure did not respond. Instead, it seemed to tilt its head in a silent plea, eyes hollow yet brimming with sorrow. In that surreal moment, I felt an electric charge run through me, an overwhelming sadness that was not my own, as if the phantom was reaching out from a deep, painful past. For days after, that image haunted me. I began noticing the phantom's presence not only in the corridors, but also in unexpected places. A fleeting glimpse behind a window, the chill by an empty bed, a soft, sorrowful moan that echoed in the dead of night. I started piecing together fragments of conversations, snippets of lore from retired staff, and the few old files I managed to get my hands on that hinted at a tragic story from decades past. There had once been a patient in the midnight ward who had died under mysterious circumstances, a patient whose death was shrouded in controversy, whose final moments were marked by terror and pain. The whispers among the old-timers spoke of negligence, a rushed diagnosis, and a cover-up that left no one to mourn but a lingering spirit that could not rest. It was during one of these long, sleepless nights that I decided to delve deeper into the hospital's past. With the assistance of some old medical records and the hesitant recollections of a few senior colleagues, I uncovered a story too harrowing to believe at first. The phantom I had seen was tied to a patient who had been inexplicably left in a state of limbo between life and death, a case of medical mishap compounded by the hospital's desperate attempts to preserve its reputation. The more I learned, the more I began to see parallels between the past and the present. My own experiences, the inexplicable cold spots, the drifting shadows, the sense of being watched, suddenly took on a new meaning. They were not random hallucinations born of overwork and isolation. They were echoes of a deep-seated tragedy, a ghost from the past trying to emerge from the confines of time. One night, as the storm battered the hospital with renewed fury, I found myself alone in the corridor once more, the echo of my footsteps the only sound breaking the oppressive silence. The air was thick with anticipation, and every nerve in my body screamed that something was about to happen. I advanced cautiously to the door of the midnight ward, the one door that should have been locked and sealed away from the rest of the hospital, yet now it stood slightly ajar, as if inviting me to uncover its secrets. My hand trembled as I pushed it open, the door groaning in protest. A gust of icy air whipped past me, carrying with it a whisper, a chorus of voices pleading for release, for recognition, for justice. Inside the ward, the dim glow of the emergency lights cast long, distorted shapes on the walls. The patient beds were arranged in a haphazard formation, and a thick layer of dust indicated that this room had not seen regular use in years. As I ventured further, my eyes landed on an old portrait pinned haphazardly to a wall, showing smiling faces of nurses and patients alike from a bygone era. The contrast between that cheerful, hopeful image and the desolation of the present sent shivers down my spine. I could almost feel the weight of their untold stories, their joys and sorrows lingering in the silence. I began searching for any clues, any remnants of the life that had once filled this neglected space. My search led me to a corner of the ward where a series of scattered personal effects lay undisturbed: a faded scarf, a pair of glasses with a cracked frame, and a journal with a leather cover. The journal, surprisingly intact despite the passage of time, was filled with entries written in a hurried, anguished hand. As I read through the entries, I learned of a patient named Evelyn, a woman whose life had been marred by misfortune and neglect. Her final entry detailed her pain and despair, her words trembling with the weight of impending loss. But what struck me most was her reference to the voices of the ward, a line that resonated with the ethereal sounds I had heard in the dead of night. In that moment, it all began to make sense. The spectral figure I had seen was not an anomaly, but a manifestation of a spirit desperate to be heard, to have her story acknowledged. The hospital, with its sterile floors and bureaucratic indifference, had long since forgotten Evelyn. Yet, in the depths of the midnight ward, her memory lived on, a living echo in every cold draft and each unsettling whisper. That night, I found myself unable to sleep, driven by an insatiable need to uncover every hidden detail of her tragic tale. The hospital records were sparse, the documentation nearly obliterated by time and inattention, but the fragments I pieced together painted a picture of negligence and sorrow. It became evident that Evelyn's death was not a mere accident of fate, but a deliberate act concealed by powerful forces within the institution. The more I dug, the more I realized that her spirit, along with those of countless others, had become the unintended custodians of the hospital's darkest secrets. I began to notice subtle shifts in the ward's ambience as I spent more nights there. The phantom patient appeared with increasing regularity, sometimes lingering in the doorway as though offering silent testimony, sometimes gliding silently past me, leaving behind an aura of despair that clung to my skin like cobwebs. In one particularly harrowing encounter, I was assisting a patient in a nearby room when I felt an icy hand brush against my shoulder. I spun around, only to see nothing but the flickering shadows dancing on the wall. My pulse pounded so hard that I could hear it in my ears, and a profound sense of isolation gripped me, as though I were the only living soul in a realm of perpetual twilight. I was left grappling with the terrifying possibility that I was entangled in something far larger and more sinister than a series of unfortunate coincidences. During one of these unsettling nights, as I made my rounds with a heaviness in my heart and a mounting dread, I paused by an empty bed that exuded a coldness that defied explanation. The air around me seemed to vibrate with a sorrowful energy, an echo of voices so indistinct yet insistent that I couldn't ignore them. In a moment of dire clarity, I closed my eyes, trying to attune myself to the energy in the room. I could almost hear a murmur, a desperate plea carried on a current of icy wind, imploring me to uncover the truth. In that ethereal moment, everything crystallized. The phantom patient was not a mere figment or a trick of the light. She was a messenger, a restless soul born from a grave injustice, trying to remind the living of debts unpaid and wrongs unavenged. The realization propelled me into action. I began documenting every anomalous occurrence in meticulous detail, notes on the shifting shadows, recordings of the faint whispers in the halls, meticulous sketches of the spectral figure as she appeared to me in fleeting glimpses. I even started discreetly speaking with the few remaining long-term staff members who had witnessed inexplicable events over the years. Their accounts, filled with a resigned sorrow and a sense of helpless inevitability, resonated with my own experiences, confirming that what I had encountered was not isolated but part of a broader, anguished tapestry of the hospital's haunted past. As I delved deeper into this mystery, strange coincidences began to surface that linked the present to the tragic events of decades past. Unexplained gaps in the hospital's records, a ward that had been officially decommissioned yet inexplicably active on night shifts, and a series of whispered warnings left in the margins of old patient files, all converged into a tapestry of evidence that pointed to a systemic cover-up. The deeper I dug, the more I felt as though I were up against an impenetrable wall of institutional denial and corruption. Every time I attempted to bring the truth to light, inexplicable accidents and subtle threats emerged, forcing me to question whether I was meddling in forces beyond mere human malice. One rainy night, as I sat hunched over my desk in the quiet solitude of the administrative corridor, reviewing a collection of dusty medical records, I began to notice a pattern. The dates, the names, the circumstances of death, they all shared a chilling common thread. It wasn't just Evelyn's story. There were countless others whose lives had been cut short under dubious circumstances, their voices silenced by a collective insistence on preserving appearances. I felt a surge of anger and determination, a need to honor those forgotten souls and expose the hidden truth behind the facade of professionalism that cloaked our institution. With trembling hands, I began compiling my findings into a comprehensive report, one that detailed not only the paranormal experiences I had endured, but also the tangible evidence of neglect and malfeasance that had left a trail of sorrow in its wake. Then, in a moment that still haunts my every waking hour, everything came to a head. Late one night, as the wind howled outside and the hospital's walls seemed to groan under the weight of accumulated despair, I was alone in the midnight ward again. The temperature dropped sharply, and I could see my breath curling in front of me like ghostly tendrils. It was then that the phantom patient appeared before me with an intensity that defied all logic. No longer did she appear as a mere shadow at the edge of vision. She stood directly in my path, her eyes filled with a plea that transcended words. In that heart-stopping moment, as thunder boomed overhead and the fabric of reality seemed to tear at the seams, she reached out with a spectral hand, her touch simultaneously cold and filled with an inexplicable warmth that belied the horror of her appearance. Time slowed, and every second stretched into an eternity of terror and empathy. I could feel her anguish, her desperate need for acknowledgement, and I realized with a jolt of clarity that this was my final chance to set things right. In that tense, surreal encounter, the ward around me seemed to fade into insignificance. The oppressive shadows, the cold drafts, the echoes of lost souls, all merged into one overwhelming manifestation of sorrow and rage. With a voice that trembled between terror and resolve, I spoke softly, promising to unearth the truth behind the tragedy that had bound her to this place. It was as if every whisper of pain, every silent accusation, and every tear of the forgotten flowed into that moment, transforming it into a convergence of past and present. I vowed to honor her memory, to carry the burden of her story with every fiber of my being, and to expose the corruption and negligence that had allowed such horrors to persist within the walls of our hospital. In the days that followed, I took my findings to the hospital administration, armed with documented evidence and the raw accounts of those who had witnessed events that defied rational explanation. The response was a mixture of incredulity and thinly veiled hostility, a refusal to revisit the past, and a desperate desire to maintain the sanctity of appearances. Yet, even as they dismissed my claims as the ramblings of an overworked nurse haunted by stress and exhaustion, I knew that I had set something into motion. That fateful night in the midnight ward had changed me irrevocably, opening my eyes to the reality that sometimes the most unassailable institutions hide their sins behind polished facades and layers of bureaucratic indifference. I had become both witness and unwilling custodian of a tragedy that spanned decades, a living testament to the echoes of sorrow that linger in the dark spaces of our world. Even now, as I recount these experiences in the quiet after hours of another night shift, I find that the memories are as vivid as ever. The phantom patient's face, etched in sorrow and defiance, appears to me in reflective surfaces and fleeting shadows. The cold drafts and soft murmurs in the corridors serve as constant reminders that the past is never truly dead. It lingers, waiting for someone brave enough or desperate enough to listen. My nights are no longer just a series of routine tasks. They are a journey into the heart of darkness, a quest to give voice to those whose lives were snuffed out in silence and neglect. The midnight ward is not merely a section of the hospital. It is a repository of forgotten dreams, unfulfilled promises, and a haunting call for justice that refuses to be ignored. I continue to work those long nights, each shift an ongoing vigil, each moment a reminder that some spirits are too restless to rest. The line between the living and the dead is thin here, blurred by the weight of hidden truths and the echoes of unresolved agony. Despite the fear and the isolation, I cling to the belief that by speaking out, by documenting and sharing these horrors, I might not only free the ghostly patients trapped by their own tragic fates, but also shine a light on the systemic failures that allowed their stories to be silenced in the first place. I am no longer just a nurse tending to the needs of the living. I have become an emissary for the dead, a chronicler of a past that demands to be remembered, however horrifying that truth may be. And so, every night as I walk the deserted corridors of the hospital, I do so with the weight of a promise made to a spectral figure whose sorrow was as real as the chill in my bones, whose silent plea for justice resonates with every creak of the floor and every flicker of the failing lights. In the silence of the midnight ward, I have come to understand that the horror is not merely in the apparitions that cross my path, but in the deliberate and callous abandonment of those who once trusted this institution with their lives. It is a horror that festers in the neglected records, in the hushed whispers of staff long resigned to silence, and in my own determination to break that cycle of neglect. As I continue my nightly rounds, I carry with me the memory of that fateful night, an experience that shattered the veil between myth and reality, forcing me to confront a darkness that goes far beyond the supernatural. I speak these words not as a tale of mere ghostly encounters, but as a personal confession of the enduring struggle to honor the lives lost in the shadows of modern medicine. In every frozen breath and every tremulous heartbeat, the phantom patient lives on, a constant reminder that some stories are too powerful to be forgotten, and that in the endless night, even the coldest rooms can whisper of redemption, of reckoning, and of an unyielding quest for truth that defies the boundaries of death itself. I never imagined that a place dedicated to history and art could harbor such unspeakable horrors. Yet, that is exactly what I found on my second night as a night guard at the Marlow Historical Museum, a sprawling institution housed in an imposing neoclassical building with aging stone walls, soaring ceilings, and halls that wind like a labyrinth of memories. What I witnessed that night defies explanation, and the horror of what I encountered still haunts my every waking moment. It all began like any other shift on a brisk November evening. I had returned to the museum for a second job after losing my previous position in a less reputable security firm. The museum staff assured me that it was merely an institution of art and antiquities, where nothing more supernatural than the occasional dripping water or creaking floorboards occurred. I believed them then, despite my own uneasy gut feeling that suggested something was very, very wrong beneath the polished facade. That night, my tasks were standard: secure the exhibits, monitor the halls, and ensure that all the doors remained locked. However, the museum's layout was different on the historical wing, an area rarely visited by the public. This wing held collections that chronicled local legends, lost civilizations, and mysterious relics with origins that spanned centuries. Rumor had it that some artifacts here carried curses or were linked to tragic pasts, but these were dismissed as tall tales by most. I, however, felt a sense of foreboding every time I passed its heavy oak doors with brass plaques engraved with archaic symbols. At exactly 10:30 p.m., I set out for my first round. I passed through the grand entrance hall, its crystal chandeliers casting quivering reflections onto the polished marble floor. Portraits of long-dead benefactors and founders lined the walls, their eyes seemingly following me as I walked. I muttered a half-hearted greeting to one particularly stern-faced man in a faded waistcoat, but he offered no response, only the unchanging, cold stare of a painted remnant of history. The first exhibit I reached was the Hall of Lost Voices, a collection dedicated to objects said to capture the whispers of those who once lived. Artifacts here included an antique phonograph rumored to record echoes of past conversations, a cracked mirror that many believed showed the face of a deceased relative, and an ancient, ornate key said to unlock memories of long-forgotten souls. I paused at the phonograph display, unable to explain why the air around it felt charged, as if saturated with a secret energy. The brass horn of the machine shone eerily in the dim light, even though it hadn't been turned on in decades. A soft, rhythmic tapping echoed from somewhere in the distance. I checked my watch. It was 10:35 p.m. Assuming it was merely a power adjustment or the building settling, I continued my rounds. I rounded a corner and entered a narrow corridor lined with sealed glass cases containing artifacts of dubious provenance. A rusted, ancient dagger, a set of ceramic figurines with eyes that seemed too lifelike, and a faded tapestry embroidered with symbols I couldn't decipher. The corridor's lighting was unusually dim here, and as I stepped closer to a display of carved stone relics from a remote temple, I noticed that the air grew inexplicably cold. I could see my breath in the pale light, and my skin prickled with an involuntary shudder. Then I heard it, a single, breathy whisper. My heart thumped in my chest as I froze. The whisper was almost imperceptible, as if someone near my ear was saying, "Help me." I spun around, half expecting to see a person, but there was only the empty corridor and the incessant hum of the ancient fluorescent lights above. My rational mind insisted it was my imagination, triggered by the oppressive atmosphere of the museum and the endless hours of solitude. I took a shaky breath and resumed my inspection. A sign on the wall pointed me toward the private archives, a small set of locked rooms at the far end of the wing. This archive was off limits to visitors and meant for the inner circle of museum staff and curators only. Tonight, however, a malfunction in the security system had left the door ajar. I hesitated for only a moment before pulling it open. The air behind the door was heavy, thick with the scent of old paper, dust, and something else. I could not quite place it. It smelled faintly metallic and oddly sweet like decaying flowers. Inside the archive, boxes and filing cabinets were arranged meticulously. Among them, I spotted an antique leather-bound journal with its cover embossed in faded gold. Curiosity compelled me to pick it up. It was Harold Marlowe's personal diary, the founder of the museum, a man reputed for his obsession with esoteric knowledge, curses, and the unexplainable. I had heard rumors about his strange experiments and cryptic writings, but reading his first-hand account was something else entirely. The diary detailed late-night experiments, occult rituals performed in secret within the museum's sub-basement, and strange occurrences witnessed by Harold himself. One entry sent shivers down my spine. Dated October 31st, 1978, it read, "Tonight, the veil thins. The voices of those long-lost call from beyond. I must pay heed to their silent cries, for they demand release. The relics speak, if one dares listen." As I flipped through subsequent pages, scribbles in shaky handwriting described events that defied logic, a spectral procession seen in the halls, disembodied figures wandering the corridors, and a ritual in the museum's crypt that ended with a bloodstain on an ancient stone altar bearing a single word, release. I set the journal down with trembling fingers as a sudden noise startled me. It was a deep, resonant thump, like the sound of heavy footsteps echoing in a cavern. The noise came from behind a thick velvet curtain that separated the archive from a small storeroom. With rational caution at war with a primal fear, I walked toward the curtain and pulled it aside. What I saw was a small room that I'd never noticed before. Its walls were lined with tattered posters from long discontinued exhibitions and dominated by a large, dusty mirror. The mirror itself was ornate, framed in carved oak with intricate patterns reminiscent of ancient runes. As I stared into the mirror, I thought I saw movement, a flicker of light, a shape passing behind me, only for the reflection to settle back into normalcy. I rubbed my eyes and backed away. The sound of the footsteps seemed to grow louder, now joined by faint, echoing whispers that sounded just beyond human comprehension. I felt a cold hand of dread grip my heart. Determined to maintain control, I grabbed my flashlight and headed back into the main corridor, leaving the secret room behind. I resumed my rounds, but every shadow and every unexpected sound now seemed loaded with menace. I passed through the gallery of timeless faces, where portraits and sculptures of historical figures appeared almost lifelike in the flickering light. As I approached a particularly somber sculpture of a long-forgotten monarch, I noticed that the eyes of the stone figure had a subtle gleam, as though tears, or something like them, were welling up. I froze for a moment, feeling that the statue was mourning, before its expression hardened back into its carved stoicism. It wasn't long before I noticed that the museum wasn't as empty as it should be. Footsteps, soft, deliberate, measured, followed my own. I stopped dead in a hallway lined with ancient tapestries depicting battles and legends. The footsteps paused, then resumed, always just out of sight. I called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" My echo was the only answer I received. The sense of being followed grew overwhelming. I turned quickly, but saw only the endless, dusty corridor. The lights overhead buzzed and hummed, and for a fleeting moment I thought I saw a pale face reflected in the glass of a display cabinet before it vanished. I ducked into a side room, locking the door behind me. In that room were the museum's minor treasures, a collection of coins from lost civilizations, and a series of ivory carvings that depicted mythical creatures. I sat on a worn bench and tried to calm my racing heart. My mind raced through the diary's passages and the strange events of the night. Had I awakened something that had been sleeping here for decades? Perhaps the museum was not simply filled with relics of the past, but with echoes of the old, dark magic that Harold Marlowe had dabbled in. I remembered his repeated insistence about release and wondered if the footsteps I heard were not human at all, but those of an entity bound to the artifacts, waiting for its chance to slip free from its ancient chains. With little choice but to confront whatever was pursuing me, I gathered my nerve and cautiously opened the door. The corridor was in shadow, illuminated only by the occasional flash of lightning from an approaching storm outside. The air had grown thick, as though time itself had slowed. I crept down the hall, every nerve alert to the rustle of fabric or the whisper of voices. The flickering lights played tricks on my eyes. For one dreadful moment, I saw the image of a small girl in a tattered dress, her eyes hollow and pleading, standing in the middle of the corridor. I blinked and she was gone. I reached what I believed was the exit door to the main hall. My hands shook as I tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The door felt as if it had grown heavy with the weight of years and something else, something intangible and malevolent. I pounded on it, calling out for help, but the silence that followed was absolute, as if the entire building was swallowing my cries. With no other option, I slipped through a side door and found myself in a dim corridor I had never seen before, one that twisted and curved unnaturally, with walls that seemed to pulse with an almost organic texture. The corridor opened into a vast chamber that felt like a cross between a museum atrium and a tomb. At its center, on a marble pedestal, was an enormous, intricately carved sarcophagus. The lid, decorated with strange symbols and figures of anguished faces, was slightly ajar. An icy draft escaped from the gap, carrying with it a faint sound like a chorus of sorrowful, distant cries. I approached the pedestal with a mixture of dread and morbid curiosity. As I reached out to touch the cold stone, the lid creaked loudly and swung fully open. Inside, instead of a mummy, lay a collection of aged photographs and personal belongings, a life once lived, now abandoned to time. Among the items was a single ornate locket, and when I picked it up, I felt an inexplicable weight settle on my soul. The locket was engraved with the initials HM, and its glass was cracked, reflecting my terrified face back at me. Suddenly, a series of disembodied voices erupted around me, overlapping and indistinct. They spoke in hushed tones, pleas, confessions, and accusations, and all at once, the chamber plunged into complete darkness. I fumbled for my flashlight, activating it just in time to reveal that the pedestal was now surrounded by figures in tattered clothing, their eyes vacant yet filled with unspeakable sorrow. They reached out with skeletal hands, their movements jerky and unnatural, as if they were marionettes controlled by a malevolent puppeteer. I backed away slowly, my heart pounding so loud it drowned out the whispers in my ears. One of the figures, an elderly man with a gaunt face and eyes that burned like coals, stepped forward and raised a hand in a trembling gesture that seemed both inviting and horrifying. His mouth opened in a silent scream, a soundless warning that chilled me to the core. In a burst of adrenaline-fueled terror, I turned and fled down the corridor. The voices trailed behind me, rising in intensity until they became a deafening cacophony of dread. I sprinted through twisting hallways that now resembled the inside of a living maze, where doors led to dead ends and windows revealed not the outside world, but other, darker corridors filled with shifting, spectral images. At every turn, I sensed unseen eyes watching, and I swore I felt icy fingers brush against my skin. After what felt like an eternity of running, I found myself back at the main atrium. The storm outside was raging, rain beating against the tall windows, and lightning illuminating the shadows that clung to the museum's walls. I collapsed onto a cold stone bench, gasping for breath, as I struggled to piece together what had happened. The entire museum seemed to pulse with a malevolent rhythm, as though it were a living entity, one that had awoken from a long slumber and was now hungering for release from the confines of its dark history. In the following days, I couldn't shake the memories of that night. I found myself drawn to research the history of the Marlowe Museum and its mysterious founder, Harold Marlowe. I discovered that Harold had been rumored to be involved in occult practices and that he had amassed many cursed relics over his lifetime. Old newspaper clippings spoke of unexplained phenomena within the museum's walls, of lights flickering in empty corridors and voices heard among the exhibits after closing time. There were even accounts from former staff members who, like me, had witnessed figures moving in the darkness. Yet none of these testimonies were ever taken seriously, dismissed as overactive imaginations or the result of isolation. I began to question whether I had merely imagined the terror of that night, or if I had truly glimpsed into something far more ancient and inexplicable. My dreams turned into vivid nightmares, endless corridors stretching into infinity, the sound of ghostly laughter echoing in the void, and that single, sorrowful gaze of the old man from the sarcophagus chamber. I woke up drenched in sweat, unable to shake the feeling that something had followed me home. One evening, unable to bear the torment any longer, I returned to the museum during the day, determined to confront the horror face to face. The museum was closed to the public, and a lone custodian meandered through the galleries as if in a daze. I managed to slip past him and entered the historical wing. The atmosphere was utterly different in daylight. Colors were more vibrant, and the oppressive feeling had lessened, replaced by a mundane sense of antiquity. Yet, as I approached the private archives once again, I felt a familiar coldness creeping over me. In a glass case on display was an old photograph of Harold Marlowe, his eyes intense and unnerving. In the background of the photo, barely visible, was a shadowed figure that looked disturbingly similar to the specter I had encountered that night. I stared at it for what seemed like hours, trying to decipher its form, until a sudden movement at the edge of my vision caused me to spin around. For a brief, horrifying moment, I saw a face contorted in pain and malice, and then it was gone. That image seared itself into my mind, a constant reminder of the curse that seemed to infect the very air of the museum. I left the building that afternoon with a heavy heart and a mind racing with unanswered questions. I knew I could no longer work there. The building had become a living nightmare that refused to let go of its dark secrets. In the weeks that followed, I became obsessed with the history of the museum and the possibility that Harold Marlowe's experiments had opened a door to something beyond our realm, a door that was never meant to be opened. I scoured archives, old newspapers, and online forums, piecing together accounts from other night guards, former employees, and even local residents who claimed that the museum was cursed. The more I read, the more I realized that I wasn't the first to encounter these horrors, and tragically, I might not be the last. One account, posted on a creepy horror forum, detailed the tragic fate of another security guard who had mysteriously vanished after working a night shift in the same museum decades ago. His friends reported hearing bizarre sounds coming from the museum long after he was gone, and later, when his belongings were found in a storage closet deep within the building, they were covered in an unexplainable layer of dust and dried blood. Other stories recounted the strange phenomenon of exhibits rearranging themselves overnight, the sound of footsteps echoing in empty corridors, and even visitors who claimed to have seen figures wandering among the relics during guided tours. I began to notice signs that the building itself might be alive, a pulsing beat echoing from the walls, the creaking floors that seemed to whisper in a language long forgotten. Some nights, I'd wake up to the sound of my own voice, softly repeating phrases I never knew I'd learned, as though the museum's dark legacy was imprinting itself upon my mind. I tried to resist, tried to forget what I had seen, but the memories were relentless. Now, I write this to warn anyone who might one day find themselves working in, or even visiting the Marlowe Historical Museum. What you witness within its walls may be more than a trick of the light or a figment of an overactive imagination. Some histories are buried so deep that disturbing them unleashes forces far beyond human control. The Museum of Forgotten Whispers is not a mere building filled with artifacts. It is a living repository of sorrow and terror, of unfulfilled cries from the past that claw their way back into the present. If you ever find yourself alone in a dimly lit museum, take heed of every whisper and shadow. Do not let curiosity lead you down dark corridors where time, memory, and fate converge into a twisted nightmare. I have seen the horrors that lie hidden behind the polished exhibits and revered relics, and I know with unyielding certainty that some secrets are best left unspoken. Even now, as I sit in a safe apartment far from that accursed place, I can still feel the museum's presence haunting me. In the dead of night, when the silence is almost suffocating, I sometimes hear faint echoes, disembodied voices reciting Harold Marlowe's desperate words from decades ago. I wonder if the museum's curse has taken root in my soul, doomed to follow me wherever I go. I urge you to be cautious with your own curiosity. What if the next time you find a door left ajar or a corridor that seems to twist into nothingness, you open it and release something that was never meant to leave its eternal prison? The relics may be silent, but the whispers they carry are anything but. I share my story not for fame or pity, but as a testament to the dangers that lurk in the forgotten corners of our past. The Marlowe Museum isn't just a collection of historical items, it's a mausoleum for memories that refuse to die, and every night it awaits the next unwary soul to cross its threshold and awaken the horrors within. Remember this: never trust a place where history seems to breathe, where echoes of the past become voices in the night. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed again, and some whispers, once heard, will follow you forever. I write these words as both a confession and a caution. The Museum of Forgotten Whispers continues to haunt my every dream and shadow my every step. I pray that by recounting these horrifying events, I might spare someone else from the same fate and remind you all that some secrets of the past are best left in darkness. It began on an ordinary, rain-soaked night when I finally decided to claim the old house I had long dreamed of owning. I'd passed over many modern apartments and brand new townhouses, but something about the faded wood, the creaking floors, and the storied past of this aging structure beckoned me. I knew from the very first visit that the house held secrets behind every locked door and dusty corner. I wasn't sure what those secrets might be, but the feeling that I was meant to uncover them was irresistible. The day I moved in was a blur of unpacking boxes, organizing old heirlooms left behind by the previous owners, and silent, almost reverent exploration. The house was a sprawling, two-story building with a peculiar layout, a narrow staircase that descended beneath the main floor to a basement I had scarcely noticed. I asked the realtor about it, and he merely shrugged, saying, "It's been empty as long as anyone can remember." I never thought much about it at the time. That first night, after I had set up a modest dinner at my reclaimed dining table and settled in with a book and a cup of lukewarm tea, I began to hear a sound that made me freeze in my armchair. It was faint at first, a soft, persistent creak that seemed to echo from below. I told myself it was just the old house settling in the cool night air. The rain pattered against the window, and all seemed calm. Yet, as the hours of darkness deepened, the sound grew unmistakably deliberate. A slow, measured thump, as if heavy footsteps were pacing down the hallway of the basement. At 2:13 a.m., I was finally roused from a restless sleep by the unmistakable groan of the house. I lay there in the silence for what seemed like an eternity before bolting upright. My heart pounded as I strained to listen. That sound, an uneven, shuffling noise, seemed to be coming from the floor below. I remembered the narrow staircase tucked away in a dark corner of the living room, its entrance partly hidden by a threadbare rug. Though I had ignored it at move-in, I now realized that the basement must hold more than just storage. Perhaps it was where the history of this house was kept hidden, locked away from prying eyes. I rose, heart in my throat, and made my way over to the stairs. Every step creaked and moaned beneath my weight, each sound amplifying the lurking dread that I couldn't dispel. With the beam of my phone's flashlight trembling in my hand, I descended into the darkness. The air was cold and musty, thick with the scent of damp earth and something else, something ancient and inexplicable. The narrow staircase led me downward in a slow spiral until I finally reached the basement door. Before I could push it open, I hesitated, swallowed hard, and listened. There it was again, the sound of footsteps, irregular and heavy, echoing like the measured pacing of an unseen presence. I pressed my ear against the cold, warped wood of the door, my skin prickling as I strained to catch even the faintest detail. There was silence on the other side now, yet I knew better than to trust that silence. Summoning every ounce of courage, I turned the rusty knob and slowly eased the door open. A weak shaft of light revealed a sprawling space that stretched into shadows far larger than I'd imagined. The basement was cluttered with remnants of a forgotten era, old furniture draped in tattered sheets, stacks of dusty crates, and cobwebs glistening in the faint glow of my phone's light. In one corner, against a sagging wall, stood a large armoire draped in dark cloth. The atmosphere pressed in on me as I stepped inside. Every breath felt labored, as though I were inhaling the very grief and regret that had seeped into these walls over countless years. I wandered slowly among the relics, noticing details that made my skin crawl. Faded photographs in sepia tones that captured families long gone, letters and documents with dates that stretched back nearly 100 years, and odd trinkets whose purpose I could not decipher. I began to wonder if these items were deliberately arranged as if to tell a story, a message left by those who had once inhabited this space. In the midst of exploring, I stumbled upon something far more disturbing. A set of fresh muddy footprints leading from the heavy armoire toward a narrow doorway in the far wall. The print was unmistakably human, though the ground in this long abandoned basement had been undisturbed for decades. And yet, here were these footprints, small, erratic, like those of a child, fresh in a place that should have been long forgotten. My mind raced with possibilities. Had someone been living here in secret? Had a lost child once wandered these corridors and been trapped? I couldn't decide whether the footprints were evidence of a sleeping presence or the result of my own overactive imagination. Despite my horror, I felt an irresistible urge to follow the trail. With cautious steps, I advanced deeper into the basement, following the trail as it curved around old workbenches and piles of discarded newspapers. Every so often, I would stop, heart pounding, to listen for any sound that might confirm my worst fears. The passageway led me to a narrow hall lined with ancient, cracked stone walls. A few rusted light fixtures hung precariously above, casting weak, uneven illumination across a series of closed, wooden doors. The footprints stopped abruptly at one of the doors, a heavy door with peeling paint and a large, ornate knocker molded in the shape of a snarling beast. I pushed my fingers against the door, feeling the chill of the surface. For a moment, I considered retreating, wondering if I'd inadvertently disturbed something I was never meant to uncover. But something deep inside, perhaps a mixture of morbid curiosity and an inexplicable sense of duty, forced me to continue. I slowly opened the door, half expecting it to creak in protest. Inside was a small, private room that looked entirely out of place. Instead of the musty, cluttered chaos of the rest of the basement, this room was organized almost as if it were a study from a bygone era. A large desk dominated the space, its surface covered with yellow papers, faded photographs, and an assortment of old, leather-bound books. The walls were lined with shelves that held delicate porcelain figurines and antique trinkets. In the center of the room, perched on a pedestal, was a large mirror framed in elaborate, dark wood. For a moment, its presence startled me. Why would this mirror, so pristine compared to the decay around it, be preserved in this secret chamber? As I stepped inside, the door closed behind me with a definitive click, echoing like a final sentence in an old, tragic story. My eyes were immediately drawn to the desk. A journal lay open, its pages scrawled in a hurried, almost frantic hand. I approached slowly and began to read. The journal detailed the recollections of someone who had lived in the house long ago, a person whose words bled with sorrow and regret. The entry spoke of a terrible family secret, of a daughter taken too soon, of a promise broken by the cruelty of fate. The author wrote of a hidden room where she had concealed evidence of the tragedy, and of a mirror that was said to hold the soul of the lost child. I felt a chill that wasn't entirely due to the cold. The entries mentioned the child's name, Lillian, and described how, in the later years, the mirror would sometimes show a faint image of her sorrowful face when the author's anguish became too great to bear. At that moment, I understood that I had stumbled upon the basement's secret, a hidden chapter of the house history that had been deliberately locked away, waiting for someone to uncover the truth. The footprints, the secret passageways, and even the locked door. All of it made sense now. The author of the journal had been a desperate soul, trying to preserve the memory of her only child, Lillian, whose life had been snuffed out by a series of misfortunes and unspoken family rivalries. The mirror, preserved in that private room, was said to be the final connection between the living and the dead, a portal for the child's spirit to remain tethered to this world. I sat down at the desk, overwhelmed by a mix of sorrow and terror. My own heart ached as I read about a life filled with loss and guilt, the desperate longing of a mother to see her child one last time. Every word in the journal carried an emotional weight that made the air in the secret study feel nearly unbearable. I could almost hear the muffled cries of a broken family echoing softly through the silence. Outside the room, footsteps began to stir once again, this time gentler, as if in cautious warning rather than threat. The sound was deliberate, measured, and filled with a strange sort of sorrow. Unable to resist the pull of the unknown, I rose from the desk and moved toward the mirror. Its surface was flawless and dark, reflecting not just my own terrified face, but also a superimposed image that chilled me to the bone. For just an instant, I saw a small figure, a little girl in a pale dress with tear-stained cheeks, standing behind me. I spun around, heart in my throat, but the room was empty save for the heavy silence and the ghost of grief that permeated every corner. I turned back to the mirror, only to see the figure again. The girl's eyes met mine with a desperate pleading, as though trying to communicate a message that transcended the barrier between the living and the dead. It was in that moment that I began to suspect that the footprints I had followed were not made by someone still alive, but rather by a spectral remnant, a child whose small feet had once padded innocently across these floors. Perhaps Lillian's spirit had roamed these corridors, searching for the love and recognition that had been denied to her in life. The journal's final entry had ended abruptly, the ink nearly smeared by tears. If anyone finds this, know that I have lost everything. Lillian, my darling, I cannot keep you hidden forever. I beg you to be remembered. That plea reverberated in my mind as I stared into the mirror. For hours, I sat in that secret study, the storm outside intensifying as if echoing the tumult within me. I resolved then that I could not let this tragic story fade into oblivion. I gathered the journal, a few of the fragile photographs, and copies of the old newspaper clippings I had found scattered in the basement. With shaking hands, I documented every detail, determined to piece together the full truth of what had transpired in this accursed house. I made several trips between the secret study and the main areas of the basement, searching for additional clues, hidden compartments in the walls, engraved initials on ancient beams, faded handprints on long-forgotten artifacts. Each discovery pulled me deeper into the sorrowful tale of Lillian and the mother who had tried in vain to preserve her memory. The basement itself seemed to transform during my investigation. Shadows lengthened and shifted in a way that suggested the lingering presence of old sorrows. It was as if the very walls exhaled memories of heartbreak and remorse, and the ambient noises, dripping water, creaking floors, the soft hum of a long-dead air conditioner, blended with whispers of the past. I found myself speaking aloud, asking questions into the darkness, hoping that somewhere amid the echoes I would hear the answer. Lillian, can you hear me? I'd call softly, and sometimes for a heartbeat, I felt that the air vibrated with a response, a faint, indistinct murmur that might have been a sigh or perhaps a plea. Weeks merged into one another as I dedicated myself to unraveling the basement's secret. Each night, after ensuring the house was locked tight, I would descend into that labyrinth of sorrow with my camera and notebook, retracing the footsteps etched into the dust. I began to record the eerie sounds and capture images that defied conventional explanation. Flickering lights in abandoned corners, a child's laughter echoing faintly, though no living soul should be present. Even moments when the mirror in the secret study reflected not my own face, but that of a small, weeping child. Sometimes, I would find new sets of muddy footprints leading away from the study into even darker recesses that I had never seen before. I followed those trails with a mix of dread and determination, too afraid to look back yet compelled to uncover every hidden part of the tragic tapestry that clung to this house. One particularly stormy night, as the wind howled like a chorus of lost souls and the rain drummed relentlessly on the roof, I uncovered a final piece of evidence. In a cramped, neglected storage room off the main basement corridor, I discovered a trunk partially hidden beneath a faded tarpaulin. Inside lay a collection of personal belongings, a small, worn teddy bear, a lock of hair sealed in a faded envelope, and a delicate silver locket engraved with the initials R. My hands trembled as I opened the locket, and inside was a tiny, sepia-toned photograph of a little girl whose sad eyes looked eerily like the apparition I had seen. This confirmation shattered any remaining hope that the haunting was but my imagination. I was in the grip of something far more real than I could have ever believed, a curse of memory and mourning that had persisted in the silence of these walls. I spent the following days compiling every scrap of documentation, every photograph, every handwritten note. I reached out to local historians and scoured old records to understand the tragic fate of Lillian and her family. I learned that the house had once belonged to a prominent family whose reputation was marred by scandal and loss. Lillian, it turned out, had been a bright, gentle child caught in the crossfire of family secrets and a bitter feud that led to a series of misfortunes culminating in a mysterious fire. The tragedy was hushed up, the memories deliberately obscured by those who wished to forget. And now, her spirit, along with that of her grieving mother, seemed to haunt the basement, the last bastion of their shattered past. With time, I began to feel that my role in this unfolding drama was not that of a mere intruder, but of a reluctant chronicler, a person entrusted with the responsibility to remember and bear witness. I created an extensive archive, digitizing photographs, transcribing every journal entry, and even publishing fragments of the story on local forums, urging anyone who might have even the faintest recollection of Lillian to come forward. The response was both heart-wrenching and bizarre. Some recounted long-forgotten family stories. Others whispered that they'd heard similar sounds in their own homes. I became a repository for the collective grief of a past generation desperate to be seen. Yet even as I documented her tragic history, the supernatural events in the basement grew more insistent. At night, I would lie awake, my eyes fixed on the dark ceiling, listening to the rhythmic thumping of footsteps and distant voices. There were moments when I could feel a cold hand brush against mine as I walked past the closed storage rooms, or when a child's giggle echoed softly, only to vanish like a mirage. The presence in the basement was not malevolent. There was a deep, overwhelming sadness in its echoes, but it was insistent, a constant reminder of a wound that had never healed. One evening, after an exhausting day of investigation and record-keeping, I returned to the secret study to find it transformed. The mirror, which had previously held only fleeting images of a weeping child, now burned with a steady, ghostly light. In its reflection, I saw not myself, but a full, sorrowful apparition, a woman in an old-fashioned dress, her face etched with grief and resignation. She appeared to be silently pleading with me, her eyes silently demanding that the truth of her loss be acknowledged. For what seemed like hours, I stood there transfixed, unable to tear my gaze away from the haunting image. In that moment, I finally understood that the basement's secret was not simply a series of random hauntings. It was a call to remember, to honor the legacy of pain and tragedy that had been walled away for far too long. I gathered my courage and addressed the apparition aloud. I will remember you. I promise I will not let your story fade into oblivion. Whether it was my words or the raw emotion behind them, the air in the room seemed to vibrate with a bittersweet relief. The apparition slowly faded, leaving behind only the soft glow of the mirror and the quiet thud of my own heartbeat. I knew that the process of healing would be long and agonizing, but at least, for now, I had done my part to break the silence. Even now, as I live in a new home and try to bury the memories of that haunted basement beneath layers of routine and modernity, I often hear the echo of those footsteps late at night. I preserve the journal and photographs in a safe place and continue to share Lillian's story with anyone willing to listen. The basement's secret is now a part of me, a reminder that the past never truly dies, and that every house, every relic, can harbor stories too painful to forget. I have learned that facing the ghosts of our history, however tragic and unsettling, is the only way to bring some measure of light into the darkness. In the echoing corridors of that basement, I found not just horror, but the profound, aching beauty of memory, loss, and ultimately, redemption. And so, whenever I hear a stray noise or catch a glimpse of a shadow in a quiet room, I pause, remember, and honor those who came before me, lest their secrets be lost in the silence forever. The Basement's Secret is my chronicle of a journey deep into the heart of a house haunted by grief, where every creak and dusty footprint speaks of lives once lived and lost. In uncovering its hidden sorrow, I found the courage to confront my own isolation and the importance of remembering the past. May this story serve as a reminder that even in our darkest, most forgotten corners, the echoes of our history call out, waiting to be heard. It began on an ordinary, rain-soaked night when I finally decided to claim the old house I had long dreamed of owning. I'd passed over many modern apartments and brand new townhouses, but something about the faded wood, the creaking floors, and the storied past of this aging structure beckoned me. I knew from the very first visit that the house held secrets behind every locked door and dusty corner. I wasn't sure what those secrets might be, but the feeling that I was meant to uncover them was irresistible. The day I moved in was a blur of unpacking boxes, organizing old heirlooms left behind by the previous owners, and silent, almost reverent exploration. The house was a sprawling, two-story building with a peculiar layout, a narrow staircase that descended beneath the main floor to a basement I had scarcely noticed. I asked the realtor about it, and he'd merely shrugged, saying, "It's been empty as long as anyone can remember." I never thought much about it at the time. That first night, after I had set up a modest dinner at my reclaimed dining table and settled in with a book and a cup of lukewarm tea, I began to hear a sound that made me freeze in my armchair. It was faint at first, a soft, persistent creak that seemed to echo from below. I told myself it was just the old house settling in the cool night air. The rain pattered against the window, and all seemed calm. Yet, as the hours of darkness deepened, the sound grew unmistakably deliberate. A slow, measured thump, as if heavy footsteps were pacing down the hallway of the basement. At 2:13 a.m., I was finally roused from a restless sleep by the unmistakable groan of the house. I lay there in the silence for what seemed like an eternity before bolting upright. My heart pounded as I strained to listen. That sound, an uneven, shuffling noise, seemed to be coming from the floor below. I remembered the narrow staircase tucked away in a dark corner of the living room, its entrance partly hidden by a threadbare rug. Though I had ignored it at move-in, I now realized that the basement must hold more than just storage. Perhaps it was where the history of this house was kept hidden, locked away from prying eyes. I rose, heart in my throat, and made my way over to the stairs. Every step creaked and moaned beneath my weight, each sound amplifying the lurking dread that I couldn't dispel. With the beam of my phone's flashlight trembling in my hand, I descended into the darkness. The air was cold and musty, thick with the scent of damp earth and something else, something ancient and inexplicable. The narrow staircase led me downward in a slow spiral until I finally reached the basement door. Before I could push it open, I hesitated, swallowed hard, and listened. There it was again, the sound of footsteps, irregular and heavy, echoing like the measured pacing of an unseen presence. I pressed my ear against the cold, warped wood of the door, my skin prickling as I strained to catch even the faintest detail. There was silence on the other side now, yet I knew better than to trust that silence. Summoning every ounce of courage, I turned the rusty knob and slowly eased the door open. A weak shaft of light revealed a sprawling space that stretched into shadows far larger than I'd imagined. The basement was cluttered with remnants of a forgotten era, old furniture draped in tattered sheets, stacks of dusty crates, and cobwebs glistening in the faint glow of my phone's light. In one corner, against a sagging wall, stood a large armoire draped in dark cloth. The atmosphere pressed in on me as I stepped inside. Every breath felt labored, as though I were inhaling the very grief and regret that had seeped into these walls over countless years. I wandered slowly among the relics, noticing details that made my skin crawl. Faded photographs in sepia tones that captured families long gone, letters and documents with dates that stretched back nearly 100 years, and odd trinkets whose purpose I could not decipher. I began to wonder if these items were deliberately arranged as if to tell a story, a message left by those who had once inhabited this space. In the midst of exploring, I stumbled upon something far more disturbing. A set of fresh muddy footprints leading from the heavy armoire toward a narrow doorway in the far wall. The print was unmistakably human, though the ground in this long abandoned basement had been undisturbed for decades. And yet, here were these footprints, small, erratic, like those of a child, fresh in a place that should have been long forgotten. My mind raced with possibilities. Had someone been living here in secret? Had a lost child once wandered these corridors and been trapped? I couldn't decide whether the footprints were evidence of a sleeping presence or the result of my own overactive imagination. Despite my horror, I felt an irresistible urge to follow the trail. With cautious steps, I advanced deeper into the basement, following the trail as it curved around old workbenches and piles of discarded newspapers. Every so often, I would stop, heart pounding, to listen for any sound that might confirm my worst fears. The passageway led me to a narrow hall lined with ancient, cracked stone walls. A few rusted light fixtures hung precariously above, casting weak, uneven illumination across a series of closed, wooden doors. The footprints stopped abruptly at one of the doors, a heavy door with peeling paint and a large, ornate knocker molded in the shape of a snarling beast. I pushed my fingers against the door, feeling the chill of the surface. For a moment, I considered retreating, wondering if I'd inadvertently disturbed something I was never meant to uncover. But something deep inside, perhaps a mixture of morbid curiosity and an inexplicable sense of duty, forced me to continue. I slowly opened the door, half expecting it to creak in protest. Inside was a small, private room that looked entirely out of place. Instead of the musty, cluttered chaos of the rest of the basement, this room was organized almost as if it were a study from a bygone era. A large desk dominated the space, its surface covered with yellowed papers, faded photographs, and an assortment of old, leather-bound books. The walls were lined with shelves that held delicate porcelain figurines and antique trinkets. In the center of the room, perched on a pedestal, was a large mirror framed in elaborate, dark wood. For a moment, its presence startled me. Why would this mirror, so pristine compared to the decay around it, be preserved in this secret chamber? As I stepped inside, the door closed behind me with a definitive click, echoing like a final sentence in an old, tragic story. My eyes were immediately drawn to the desk. A journal lay open, its pages scrawled in a hurried, almost frantic hand. I approached slowly and began to read. The journal detailed the recollections of someone who had lived in the house long ago, a person whose words bled with sorrow and regret. The entry spoke of a terrible family secret, of a daughter taken too soon, of a promise broken by the cruelty of fate. The author wrote of a hidden room where she had concealed evidence of the tragedy, and of a mirror that was said to hold the soul of the lost child. I felt a chill that wasn't entirely due to the cold. The entries mentioned the child's name, Lillian, and described how, in the later years, the mirror would sometimes show a faint image of her sorrowful face when the author's anguish became too great to bear. At that moment, I understood that I had stumbled upon the basement's secret, a hidden chapter of the house history that had been deliberately locked away, waiting for someone to uncover the truth. The footprints, the secret passageways, and even the locked door, all of it made sense now. The author of the journal had been a desperate soul, trying to preserve the memory of her only child, Lillian, whose life had been snuffed out by a series of misfortunes and unspoken family rivalries. The mirror, preserved in that private room, was said to be the final connection between the living and the dead, a portal for the child's spirit to remain tethered to this world. I sat down at the desk, overwhelmed by a mix of sorrow and terror. My own heart ached as I read about a life filled with loss and guilt, the desperate longing of a mother to see her child one last time. Every word in the journal carried an emotional weight that made the air in the secret study feel nearly unbearable. I could almost hear the muffled cries of a broken family echoing softly through the silence. Outside the room, footsteps began to stir once again, this time gentler, as if in cautious warning rather than threat. The sound was deliberate, measured, and filled with a strange sort of sorrow. Unable to resist the pull of the unknown, I rose from the desk and moved toward the mirror. Its surface was flawless and dark, reflecting not just my own terrified face, but also a superimposed image that chilled me to the bone. For just an instant, I saw a small figure, a little girl in a pale dress with tear-stained cheeks, standing behind me. I spun around, heart in my throat, but the room was empty save for the heavy silence and the ghost of grief that permeated every corner. I turned back to the mirror, only to see the figure again. The girl's eyes met mine with a desperate pleading, as though trying to communicate a message that transcended the barrier between the living and the dead. It was in that moment that I began to suspect that the footprints I had followed were not made by someone still alive, but rather by a spectral remnant, a child whose small feet had once padded innocently across these floors. Perhaps Lillian's spirit had roamed these corridors, searching for the love and recognition that had been denied to her in life. The journal's final entry had ended abruptly, the ink nearly smeared by tears. If anyone finds this, know that I have lost everything. Lillian, my darling, I cannot keep you hidden forever. I beg you to be remembered. That plea reverberated in my mind as I stared into the mirror. For hours, I sat in that secret study, the storm outside intensifying as if echoing the tumult within me. I resolved then that I could not let this tragic story fade into oblivion. I gathered the journal, a few of the fragile photographs, and copies of the old newspaper clippings I had found scattered in the basement. With shaking hands, I documented every detail, determined to piece together the full truth of what had transpired in this accursed house. I made several trips between the secret study and the main areas of the basement, searching for additional clues, hidden compartments in the walls, engraved initials on ancient beams, faded handprints on long-forgotten artifacts. Each discovery pulled me deeper into the sorrowful tale of Lillian and the mother who had tried in vain to preserve her memory. The basement itself seemed to transform during my investigation. Shadows lengthened and shifted in a way that suggested the lingering presence of old sorrows. It was as if the very walls exhaled memories of heartbreak and remorse, and the ambient noises, dripping water, creaking floors, the soft hum of a long-dead air conditioner, blended with whispers of the past. I found myself speaking aloud, asking questions into the darkness, hoping that somewhere amid the echoes I would hear the answer. Lillian, can you hear me? I'd call softly, and sometimes for a heartbeat, I felt that the air vibrated with a response, a faint, indistinct murmur that might have been a sigh or perhaps a plea. Weeks merged into one another as I dedicated myself to unraveling the basement's secret. Each night, after ensuring the house was locked tight, I would descend into that labyrinth of sorrow with my camera and notebook, retracing the footsteps etched into the dust. I began to record the eerie sounds and capture images that defied conventional explanation. Flickering lights in abandoned corners, a child's laughter echoing faintly, though no living soul should be present. Even moments when the mirror in the secret study reflected not my own face, but that of a small, weeping child. Sometimes I would find new sets of muddy footprints leading away from the study into even darker recesses that I had never seen before. I followed those trails with a mix of dread and determination, too afraid to look back yet compelled to uncover every hidden part of the tragic tapestry that clung to this house. One particularly stormy night, as the wind howled like a chorus of lost souls and the rain drummed relentlessly on the roof, I uncovered a final piece of evidence. In a cramped, neglected storage room off the main basement corridor, I discovered a trunk partially hidden beneath a faded tarpaulin. Inside lay a collection of personal belongings, a small, worn teddy bear, a lock of hair sealed in a faded envelope, and a delicate silver locket engraved with the initials R. My hands trembled as I opened the locket, and inside was a tiny, sepia-toned photograph of a little girl whose sad eyes looked eerily like the apparition I had seen. This confirmation shattered any remaining hope that the haunting was but my imagination. I was in the grip of something far more real than I could have ever believed, a curse of memory and mourning that had persisted in the silence of these walls. I spent the following days compiling every scrap of documentation, every photograph, every handwritten note. I reached out to local historians and scoured old records to understand the tragic fate of Lillian and her family. I learned that the house had once belonged to a prominent family whose reputation was marred by scandal and loss. Lillian, it turned out, had been a bright, gentle child caught in the crossfire of family secrets and a bitter feud that led to a series of misfortunes culminating in a mysterious fire. The tragedy was hushed up, the memories deliberately obscured by those who wished to forget. And now, her spirit, along with that of her grieving mother, seemed to haunt the basement, the last bastion of their shattered past. With time, I began to feel that my role in this unfolding drama was not that of a mere intruder, but of a reluctant chronicler, a person entrusted with the responsibility to remember and bear witness. I created an extensive archive, digitizing photographs, transcribing every journal entry, and even publishing fragments of the story on local forums, urging anyone who might have even the faintest recollection of Lillian to come forward. The response was both heart-wrenching and bizarre. Some recounted long-forgotten family stories. Others whispered that they'd heard similar sounds in their own homes. I became a repository for the collective grief of a past generation desperate to be seen. Yet even as I documented her tragic history, the supernatural events in the basement grew more insistent. At night, I would lie awake, my eyes fixed on the dark ceiling, listening to the rhythmic thumping of footsteps and distant voices. There were moments when I could feel a cold hand brush against mine as I walked past the closed storage rooms, or when a child's giggle echoed softly, only to vanish like a mirage. The presence in the basement was not malevolent. There was a deep, overwhelming sadness in its echoes, but it was insistent, a constant reminder of a wound that had never healed. One evening, after an exhausting day of investigation and record-keeping, I returned to the secret study to find it transformed. The mirror, which had previously held only fleeting images of a weeping child, now burned with a steady, ghostly light. In its reflection, I saw not myself, but a full, sorrowful apparition, a woman in an old-fashioned dress, her face etched with grief and resignation. She appeared to be silently pleading with me, her eyes silently demanding that the truth of her loss be acknowledged. For what seemed like hours, I stood there transfixed, unable to tear my gaze away from the haunting image. In that moment, I finally understood that the basement's secret was not simply a series of random hauntings. It was a call to remember, to honor the legacy of pain and tragedy that had been walled away for far too long. I gathered my courage and addressed the apparition aloud. I will remember you. I promise I will not let your story fade into oblivion. Whether it was my words or the raw emotion behind them, the air in the room seemed to vibrate with a bittersweet relief. The apparition slowly faded, leaving behind only the soft glow of the mirror and the quiet thud of my own heartbeat. I knew that the process of healing would be long and agonizing, but at least, for now, I had done my part to break the silence. Even now, as I live in a new home and try to bury the memories of that haunted basement beneath layers of routine and modernity, I often hear the echo of those footsteps late at night. I preserve the journal and photographs in a safe place and continue to share Lillian's story with anyone willing to listen. The basement's secret is now a part of me, a reminder that the past never truly dies, and that every house, every relic, can harbor stories too painful to forget. I have learned that facing the ghosts of our history, however tragic and unsettling, is the only way to bring some measure of light into the darkness. In the echoing corridors of that basement, I found not just horror, but the profound, aching beauty of memory, loss, and ultimately, redemption. And so, whenever I hear a stray noise or catch a glimpse of a shadow in a quiet room, I pause, remember, and honor those who came before me, lest their secrets be lost in the silence forever. The basement's secret is my chronicle of a journey deep into the heart of a house haunted by grief, where every creak and dusty footprint speaks of lives once lived and lost. In uncovering its hidden sorrow, I found the courage to confront my own isolation and the importance of remembering the past. May this story serve as a reminder that even in our darkest, most forgotten corners, the echoes of our history call out, waiting to be heard. I'd planned a short solo trip into the backcountry, a chance to escape the relentless pulse of modern life and lose myself in the quiet austerity of nature. I was drawn, however, not just by the call of solitude, but by a peculiar rumor I'd heard whispered in local bars, of a forgotten cabin hidden deep within these woods, a relic of a past that had long been buried by time. No map marked its location, and locals claimed its existence was an urban legend. But legends, as I soon learned, often have kernels of disturbing truth. I set out on a crisp autumn morning, backpack loaded with a few essentials and a meticulously drawn route that I had planned from approximate coordinates. The forest welcomed me with a muted symphony of rustling leaves and distant bird calls. The deeper I ventured, the more I felt the pervasive solitude transform into a heavy, expectant quiet, as if the woods were holding their breath in anticipation. About 6 hours into my hike, fatigue mingled with an inexplicable sense of urgency. I found myself wandering off the beaten path, drawn by a faint glimmer of sunlight that filtered through a peculiar gap in the dense canopy. There, almost hidden by overgrown ferns and tangled vines, stood a narrow clearing. In the center, half swallowed by creeping ivy and shadows, was a dilapidated cabin that looked as though it had been abandoned for decades. I stopped dead in my tracks. My heart hammered as I approached the weathered structure. The cabin was constructed of dark, splintered logs, its once proud architecture now reduced to uneven walls and sagging roofs. Its windows, shattered and crusted with grime, seemed like the hollow eyes of a long-dead sentinel. The very sight of it sent a chill coursing through my veins. The path to the cabin was uneven and obscured by fallen branches. I hesitated at the threshold, an uneasy mix of dread and curiosity pulling me forward. As I stepped into the clearing, a metallic tang filled the air, a scent of decay and rust that seemed out of place in the otherwise crisp, invigorating forest. The overgrown grass reached up to my boots as if to warn me not to tread further, yet my determination and morbid fascination forced my feet onward. Inside, the cabin's interior was shrouded in gloom, lit only by stray beams of light that pierced through holes in the rotted roof. Dust motes danced in the slivers of sunlight, lending a surreal quality to the scene. The floorboards creaked underfoot, and every step I took sounded like a whisper of long-forgotten secrets. As I explored further, I discovered that the cabin comprised only a few small rooms, a living area with a collapsed fireplace, a narrow kitchen nook with a rusted sink, and a single bedroom. On a rickety table in the living area lay several objects that immediately attracted my attention. Among them was a half-burned photograph in an ornate frame. The faded image captured a family, a father, a mother, and 2 children, all wearing somber expressions as though they were guarding a secret. Their eyes, even in the decay of the photograph, seemed to plead for help. Next to it, I found a leather-bound journal, its cover cracked and stained with what looked like old blood. The pages within were filled with frantic, nearly illegible script, interspersed with sketches of symbols I didn't recognize. I could feel my pulse quickening. There was an undeniable, almost palpable energy in this cabin, a residual imprint of lives lived in terror, sorrow, and perhaps even something darker. As I leafed through the journal, I discovered entries that detailed the life of a man who had once lived in seclusion in these woods. His words were desperate and erratic. He wrote of nightly visits by mysterious figures, of voices that whispered his name from the darkness, and of sinister rituals performed under the cold light of the moon. One entry mentioned a covenant of blood sealed within these very walls, a secret too dangerous to be left unsaid. The deeper I delved into the journal, the more my rational mind began to unravel. The narrative revealed that the cabin was once a meeting point for individuals who had forsaken society to worship something ancient and unspeakable. They believed that by forging a pact with this entity, they could gain immortality or an escape from the torments of mortal life. But something had gone horribly wrong. The accounts were filled with despair, betrayal, and the chilling realization that the entity they courted was not a benevolent savior, but a merciless force that demanded blood and souls in return. Late that afternoon, as the sun began its slow descent, I realized I'd lost track of time. The shadows grew longer, and an oppressive darkness started to seep into every corner of the clearing. I made a mental note to document every detail, every emotion that surged within me, feeling increasingly that I was stepping into someone else's nightmare, a nightmare that might not let go so easily. I decided to set up camp near the cabin. I was both repulsed and compelled by this place. Repulsed by the weight of its tragic past and compelled by a need to understand it. In the relative safety of a clearing, I built a small fire, its flickering glow dancing against the backdrop of ancient trees. The fire provided a semblance of warmth, but the night air was filled with an unholy chill that seemed to seep through my very soul. Almost immediately, I began to notice things that defied natural explanation. At first, it was subtle, a scratching sound coming from the walls of the cabin that I couldn't attribute to any animal I knew of, a soft rustling that seemed too deliberate to be the wind. Then came the whispers. Faint, murmured voices, as though echoing from the depths of the forest. They seemed to speak in broken sentences, half-formed pleas and warnings that I could barely decipher. I sat rigid, straining to understand their message, my hand trembling as I clutched the journal. I tried to dismiss it as my imagination. After all, I'd spent hours alone in a decrepit cabin, and the isolation was bound to play tricks on my mind. But as the night deepened, the voices grew louder and seemed to come from everywhere at once. They called out names, some familiar, others utterly alien, and they spoke of darkness and the inevitability of fate. I felt as if the cabin itself were alive, its every creak and groan a lament for the terrible deeds committed within its walls. Around midnight, I couldn't take it anymore. An inexplicable dread urged me to return to my tent, away from the oppressive presence of the cabin. But as I turned to leave, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye, a figure standing at the far end of the room, barely discernible in the gloom. It looked like a person, yet its features were blurred and shifting, as though it were a mirage conjured up by my mind. I froze, my throat tight with a scream that I could not let out. The figure began to move slowly, almost gliding towards me. Every instinct screamed for me to run, but my body was paralyzed by a mix of terror and disbelief. As it drew nearer, I could see that its eyes held a strange intensity, an ancient sorrow and resignation that seemed to pierce right through me. I couldn't tell if it was reaching out in an act of warning or if it was merely a specter of the past, doomed to wander these halls forever. I tried to speak, but only a choked whisper came out. "Who are you?" The figure halted a few feet away, as if deliberating whether my question was worth an answer. For what seemed like an eternity, we simply stared at each other in a silence that was more deafening than any scream could have been. Then, as silently as it had appeared, the figure dissipated into thin air, leaving behind a palpable void, a lingering presence that made my skin crawl. I spent the rest of that night huddled by the fire, listening to the murmurs of the unseen, my thoughts racing as I recalled the diary entries and the haunting images in the photograph. In the morning, I decided to investigate further. Something inside me demanded answers, even if it meant confronting the darkness head-on. Returning to the cabin, I meticulously searched every nook and cranny. In a hidden compartment beneath a loose floorboard in the living area, I discovered a small, rusted key. It was engraved with odd symbols that matched those in the journal, and it felt unnervingly warm to the touch, almost as if it had been waiting for me. My pulse accelerated as I realized this key might unlock something critical, a mystery that had long been locked away in time. With trembling hands, I made my way to a narrow door concealed behind a torn curtain in the bedroom. The door creaked open to reveal a small, cramped room that seemed frozen in a different era. The walls were lined with faded photographs, newspaper clippings, and handwritten letters. In the center of the room sat a wooden desk with an ornate mirror. As I gazed into the mirror, I didn't just see my own reflection. I saw fleeting images, faces of people long gone, their expressions etched with horror and longing. For a brief moment, I felt a surge of profound empathy, as though those souls were trapped in a never-ending cycle of suffering, desperate for release. I carefully lifted one of the letters and began to read. It detailed the tragic history of the cabin's inhabitants, a family shattered by grief when one member had gone missing under mysterious circumstances. The missing person was rumored to have been ensnared by the cult that once occupied the cabin, their fate sealed by a horrific pact. According to the letter, the family believed that if the wrong person were to find the cabin and disturb its sanctity, the vengeful spirit of the missing person would claim them as retribution. I shivered as I pieced together each detail. The intensity of my emotions was overwhelming. The air in that secret room felt charged, as though the very walls harbored the sorrow and rage of those lost souls. My mind reeled with questions. Was I merely an accidental intruder, or had fate guided me here to relive the final, horrifying chapter of a tormented family's legacy? As dusk began to fall, I felt an almost magnetic pull towards the mirror again. I could no longer ignore the sense of foreboding that clung to every inch of the cabin. The whispers had ceased for a while, and eerie silence settled in their place, broken only by the occasional creak of the settling wood. In the gathering gloom, I decided it was time to leave. The forest beyond the clearing no longer offered solace. It now seemed to be a labyrinth of haunted recollections that might claim me as their next victim. I gathered the journal, the key, and the few letters I could salvage, carefully tucking them into my backpack as tangible pieces of a mystery that was bigger than I had ever imagined. Every step I took back towards the clearing was accompanied by an oppressive sense of being watched, not only by the eyes of ancient trees, but by something far more malevolent lurking in the shadows. Outside, the woods had transformed into a realm of nightmares. The interplay of moonlight and darkness rendered every shape sinister. I stumbled through the underbrush with my heart pounding, each distant rustle or cracking twig sending shockwaves of terror through my mind. It wasn't long before I realized that I wasn't alone on this path. Footsteps echoed mine, sometimes matching my pace, sometimes trailing just behind. I quickened my speed, the forest suddenly full of unseen predators. In a desperate bid for escape, I veered off the narrow trail and plunged into a tangled mass of trees and brambles. The oppressive darkness seemed to close in on me, and somewhere in the distance, I could hear a low, guttural sound, a sound that could only belong to something not entirely human. Every instinct urged me to run faster, my legs moving on their own as I tried to outrun the looming nightmare. After what felt like an eternity of frantic running, I burst into a small clearing. There, the forest opened up, revealing a moonlit pond with glassy, undisturbed water. For a fleeting moment, I felt a hint of relief. I crouched near the water's edge, panting and glancing around nervously, convinced that any movement in the dark woods would signal the approach of my pursuer. The silence of the pond was eerily perfect, until I noticed my own reflection ripple and blur as if something had disturbed it from behind. Slowly, I turned, and there in the gloom stood a gaunt figure draped in tattered clothing. Its eyes glowed faintly under the moon's pale light, and its elongated fingers pointed directly at me. I dared not speak, terrified that any sound would shatter the fragile tranquility and bring upon me a fate beyond imagining. The figure advanced slowly, each step deliberate and heavy with a sense of inevitability. In that agonizing moment, memories of the diary entries and the heartfelt letters came flooding back. I understood that I was not simply witnessing the tragedies of the past. I was part of an unbroken chain linking the lost souls of the cabin to the present. The figure, whether spirit or something else entirely, was a guardian of secrets too terrible to be forgotten. It reached out with a trembling hand, as if inviting me to uncover the truth hidden in the darkness. I felt a strange compulsion that overrode my natural instinct to flee, a need to understand what had been set in motion long ago. My body slowed, and I met the figure's gaze. In the reflection of its eyes, I saw a lifetime of grief, betrayal, and a desperate hope for redemption. Then, as silently as it had appeared, the spectral figure faded into the night. I was left alone by the pond, shaken to my core and grappling with the realization that the boundary between the living and the dead was thinner here than anywhere else. Clambering to my feet, I resolved that I could not abandon the truth that the cabin and its haunted past demanded to be understood. The trek back through the forest was a trial of endurance and willpower. Every snap of twig underfoot was a reminder of unseen eyes tracking my progress. When I finally emerged from the oppressive darkness of the woods and back onto a faint, nearly forgotten logging road, the break of dawn was my only solace. In the days that followed, I pored over the journal and the salvaged letters, trying to piece together the tragic timeline of the cabin's occupants. I learned that the missing member of that family had been involved with a secretive sect that believed in transcending mortal existence through forbidden rituals. Their hopes had twisted into madness, and when the ritual went awry, it did not end with death, but with a curse, a lingering presence bound to the site and to anyone who dared disturb its slumber. I contacted local historians and delved into archived records, finding whispers of these events in dusty county documents and town folklore. The deeper I dug, the more it became evident that what I had experienced was not an isolated incident, but a thread woven into a fabric of recurring tragedies spanning generations. Every night since my escape, I have dreamed of that cabin. I see myself wandering its gloomy corridors, hearing the soft whispers of voices that beg for release, and witnessing spectral figures silently reenact the horrors of that forgotten past. I can't shake the feeling that I am now linked to the fate of that place. I have become a reluctant guardian of its secrets, burdened with the knowledge that some mysteries are perhaps best left undisturbed. Every new day is colored by a lingering dread and an almost inevitable pull back to that clearing in the woods. Even now, as I sit before my computer recounting these events, I can still smell the metallic tang of decay, see the brittle image of the family's pleading eyes, and feel the oppressive weight of the cabin's sorrow. I have returned to civilization physically, Yet a part of me remains forever in those dark woods. The memory of that spectral figure at the pond is a permanent scar on my psyche, a reminder that some places and some secrets can never truly be left behind. I live with the constant question, was I merely an unwitting trespasser, or did fate lead me to that cabin to resolve something unfinished? Perhaps one day I will return, not as a frightened wanderer, but as a seeker of truth willing to confront the darkness at its source. Until that time, I carry with me the echo of that night, a chilling symphony of sorrow and despair that haunts my every waking moment. The cabin in the clearing remains an enigma, a silent testament to horrors past and a constant reminder that in the depths of the woods, some secrets do not want to be discovered. I now know that some horrors are not confined to the pages of forgotten diaries or the whispered legends of old-timers. They lurk in the dark recesses of time and space, waiting patiently for someone to stir them awake. And as the nights grow longer and the shadows creep in earlier with each passing autumn, I can't help but wonder if I am being watched still. If the forest ever truly lets go of its captive souls, or if I am destined to walk alongside them for the rest of my days. For now, I have survived that terrible night, but the whispers continue in my dreams, and the spectral face at the pond lingers in my mind. The memory of that cursed cabin, its forgotten legacy of despair, and the unyielding pull of its dark mystery will remain with me, a permanent part of who I am, until the day I finally face it again. I had always felt a comfortable solitude in my old family home, a place full of memories, creaking floorboards, and the subtle hush of age. That late autumn evening, as I sat alone in the living room with only the soft glow of a single lamp to break the darkness, I began to wonder if the quiet was perhaps a little too quiet. The wind outside rattled against the window panes and rain drummed on the roof, but there was something else, a series of faint, deliberate thumps echoing from above. At first, I assumed it was merely the settling of an old house against a chill night. I had spent the afternoon cleaning and organizing, and maybe the temperature drop had caused the wood to contract. But as minutes turned to hours, the thumping grew more insistent. Every so often, I would pause mid-sip of my lukewarm tea and strain to listen, my heart pounding in my ears. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was out there, watching. I remembered childhood warnings about the attic. My mother once told me, with a half smile that was meant to gently tease, "Don't ever go up there after dark, dear. Some secrets are better left forgotten." At the time, I'd laughed it off. But now, alone in this vast, creaking house, those old tales of a restless presence lurking among dust and forgotten relics began to feel all too real. I tried to distract myself by flicking through an old photo album. The images of sunlit days and smiling faces did little to quiet the rising tension. Instead, an icy dread crept over me every time I caught a sound, a soft rustling in the ceiling, a scrape as if an object were dragging along the beams. I could almost swear I heard a whisper, indistinct yet laden with a meaning I couldn't fathom. After what felt like an eternity, I stood and approached the narrow doorway that led to the attic. The door, painted a faded pale blue, hung slightly off its hinges. Its peeling paint and age-worn brass handle gave it an aura of melancholy abandonment. I hesitated at its threshold, half expecting to hear something from within, maybe a rasping voice or even the quiet sound of a sob. Instead, there was only silence. I flicked on my cell phone's flashlight and, with trembling hands, pushed open the door. A burst of stale, dust-laden air enveloped me as the old wooden stairs creaked under my weight. I climbed slowly, each step punctuated by the echo of my rising heartbeat. The atmosphere grew thicker the higher I ascended, a mix of despair, hidden grief, and a sense of foreboding that prickled at the back of my neck. At the top of the stairs, I paused at the narrow entryway. The attic revealed itself in weak, spectral light that streamed through a grimy window. Boxes, old furniture shrouded in yellowing sheets, and cobweb trinkets filled the space. each relic a silent witness to the passage of time. Yet, in the far corner of the room, I sensed movement, a dark, indistinct shape that didn't belong among the dusty antiques. I aimed the beam of my phone's light at the shape. For an instant, the darkness receded, and I saw nothing but shadows. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, it reappeared. My breath caught in my throat. There, standing in the dim haze near a battered mirror, was a figure as vague as smoke. Its form was human enough, shoulders stooped, head slightly bowed, but its eyes were the most unnerving part. Deep, hollow voids that seemed to blink in and out of existence, as if they were trying to tell me a secret. I froze on the spot, my mind racing. Was this a trick of the light? Had my imagination, fueled by too many late-night horror movies, finally gotten the better of me? The figure did not move, yet I felt as though its gaze bore into the very soul of my being. Every instinct urged me to run down the stairs, to retreat back to the safety of the living room, but a deeper, inexplicable compulsion held me there. A soft, almost imperceptible whisper floated through the stagnant air. I couldn't make out the words, but they carried a weight that pressed against my chest like a physical burden. I know you. The sound seemed to say, trailing off into a faint wail that mingled with the moan of the wind outside. It wasn't a familiar voice, and it filled me with a primal terror that I had long thought belonged only in nightmares. I wanted to call out, to demand that the presence show itself or speak clearly, but the sound died in my throat. Instead, I stood in that oppressive silence, paralyzed by the intensity of my own fear and the weight of the unknown. In that moment, every creak of the wood and every exhale of the wind sounded like a deliberate message, a coded invitation to confront something buried deep within the house history, or perhaps within my own troubled memories. Gathering every ounce of courage, I stepped forward into the center of the attic. The beam of my light wavered as my hand trembled uncontrollably. I moved closer to the mirror, where the figure seemed most concentrated, and in its reflection I caught a glimpse of something more, a flash of an old photograph pinned crookedly to the wall behind it. I couldn't tell at first, but as I drew near, I recognized it as a portrait of a solemn young woman with sorrowful eyes. A date scrawled at the bottom read, 1912. A chill ran down my spine as the pieces began to merge in my mind. My grandmother had once told me stories of a tragic occurrence in this house, a long-ago death, a mysterious loss, and a promise that the spirit of the departed would forever roam the upper floors, seeking recognition and closure. Had I unwittingly provoked this specter simply by setting foot in the very place where it once lived? Or was it that the presence had lain dormant, waiting for me, the new occupant, to stir it awake? The atmosphere thickened, and the air grew colder. The figure in the mirror began to shift imperceptibly, its form elongating and contracting as if struggling against some unseen force. I could now distinctly see a pair of lips part in a silent plea, and in that fleeting moment, a torrent of images flooded my mind. Memories of a life before a sudden, inexplicable tragedy, the sound of laughter silenced by sorrow, the echo of footsteps in an empty corridor, and a desperate cry for help that went unanswered. The figure moved with an unnatural fluidity toward me. I felt as though it was not merely an image, but a presence, a being desperate to make contact. I took a cautious step back, my entire body trembling as if iced over. Then, in a voice that seemed to come from both nowhere and everywhere, it whispered, "Remember. Please remember." I stared at the words, caught between disbelief and terror. What did it mean? Was it pleading for recognition of a forgotten history, a forgotten name? Was it warning me of a danger that loomed over this place? My mind churned with questions, and each creak of the ancient wood felt like an answer I was too afraid to hear. The oppressive silence broke with a sudden, harsh sound, a loud thump behind me that resounded through the attic like a final, ominous drum. I spun around, heart in my throat, only to see the heavy shadow of a large trunk sliding slightly across the floor. Nothing else moved, yet the echo of that sound reverberated within me. In that charged instant, I recognized that this was not a figment conjured by my overactive mind. It was real. This presence was real. I fumbled with my phone and managed to record a few seconds of what I could only describe as a low, mournful hum that emanated from the very walls of the attic. The sound was both beautiful and heartbreaking, a dirge for forgotten souls. As the recording continued, I saw the figure gradually recede, melting back into the surrounding gloom as if it had never been there at all. Before I could decide on my next course of action, a clatter upstairs startled me from the recording's trance. The sound of heavy footsteps, deliberate and echoing, trailed from above. I glanced toward the only door leading further into the darkness, a narrow doorway that I'd always assumed led only to storage or old bedrooms. Now it pulsed with an eerie, inviting glow. With each beat of my heart, I felt the pull of an unseen force urging me to follow the sound. Against every instinct screaming at me to flee, I moved toward that door. My hand brushed against cold, peeling wallpaper that seemed almost to tremble in anticipation. I pushed the door open slowly, and a new corridor revealed itself, a long, narrow passage lined with faded photographs and dust-covered relics. The footsteps grew louder, more insistent, until they almost drowned out my own panicked breathing. I forced myself forward, using the beam of my phone to guide my steps. Every door along the corridor was slightly ajar, as though each one carried a secret waiting to be unveiled. At the far end, I discovered a door that was slightly different from the rest. Its surface was smudged with streaks of dark, dried blood. I couldn't tell if it was real or merely the play of shadows, but it filled me with a cold, aching dread. With trembling determination, I pushed it open. Inside was a small room that looked more like a forgotten study than part of the main house. A single, time-worn desk stood in one corner, and above it, on the wall, hung an ornate mirror in an intricately carved frame. The air in that room was even colder than the corridor, and it seemed to vibrate with the echoes of the past. There, at the desk, lay a battered leather journal with yellowed pages. I picked it up, the weight of it sending a shiver down my spine. As I opened the journal, a message was scrawled across the first page in shaky, desperate handwriting. I am trapped in these walls. Remember me. They took everything, my name, my love, my life. The faded ink and the style of the letter suggested a century-old sorrow, a tragedy that had long been buried. At that moment, I felt a presence behind me, a cold breath on the back of my neck that made my skin crawl. I spun around, heart pounding, but saw nothing. The silence was absolute, as if the very air had held its breath. I clutched the journal to my chest, unsure if it was a warning, a plea, or a confession. Then came another whisper, clearer this time, and almost pleading. Help me. The voice was soft, yet imbued with immense sorrow. It tugged at my very soul as if it were a part of me long forgotten. I stepped forward, unable to resist any longer, and placed a trembling hand on the cold wall. In that contact, I felt a surge of emotions, pain, loss, and an overwhelming loneliness that mirrored my own isolation. It was as if the ghost of that lost soul reached out, desperate for acknowledgement, for someone to remember its existence. For what seemed like hours, I stood there in that small study, oscillating between terror and empathy. The whispers continued intermittently, sometimes a soft murmur, sometimes a desperate cry. I could not tell if they were coming from the walls, the floorboards, or the very air itself. All I knew was that something in this house had been broken long ago, and now the damage was not confined to wood and dust, but to the fragile remnants of human hearts. The storm outside reached a fevered pitch, and lightning illuminated the room in jagged bursts. In one such flash, I saw a glimpse of a face in the mirror above the desk, a face drawn with heartbreak and despair. In that split second, I understood that the specter was not my enemy, but a wounded soul reaching out for release. The diary and the shattered reflections were fragments of a history steeped in forgotten pain, a life that had been taken away by circumstances too terrible to bear. I resolved then to do something. I had to remember. I had to honor the plea of this unseen presence by discovering its story, by piecing together the fragments of a long-forgotten tragedy. I dashed down the corridor back to the living room, clutching the journal as if it were a lifeline, and started to search through the house for clues, old letters tucked behind faded wallpaper, photographs hidden under loose floorboards, and even records of local deaths archived in a dusty family cabinet. Every discovery deepened the mystery. I found an old newspaper clipping from 1912 detailing a bitter tragedy. A young woman, known only by her first name, Eleanor, had vanished mysteriously after a scandalous affair within this very house. Rumors had swirled for years, whispers of betrayal, sorrow, and a restless spirit left behind. The journal's writing mirrored the style of those days, and the despair was unmistakable. As the night wore on, I felt the presence drawing nearer. Shadows crept along the walls, and I could sense the ghost's watchful eyes tracking my every move. I began to fear that by delving too deeply, I might awaken forces far beyond my control. Yet, every fiber of my being screamed that I could not abandon Eleanor to the silence of the attic forever. I had to remember her. I had to set her spirit free. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps behind me, the same slow, measured thuds from earlier, echoed again from the staircase. I backed away from the desk, journal in trembling grip, as the sound became nearer, and then paused right at the threshold of the study. My pulse raced, and for a frozen moment, the world seemed to slow. Then, as if in response to my silent plea, the door behind me creaked open. I spun around and caught sight of the ghostly figure emerging from the shadow of the corridor, its hollow eyes fixed upon me with an intensity that cut through the darkness. There was no malice in its gaze, only an overwhelming, unfulfilled longing for recognition and resolution. The figure's voice, now clear as crystal in my mind, murmured, "I'm so tired. Please help me remember." The plea resonated through me, echoing the quiet sorrow that I had felt in the cold touch against the wall. I whispered in response, "I will not let you fade away. I'll remember, I promise." The specter's form wavered, as though caught between existence and oblivion. I felt an almost tangible weight lifting from the room as the ghost's features softened. For a moment, the oppressive dread eased, replaced by an inexplicable compassion. I reached out toward the figure, but as my fingers neared the ephemeral form, it dissipated like smoke in the wind, leaving only a fading echo of its desperate call. In that silence, I understood that the entity's message was not to instill terror, but to remind me of the human cost of forgotten history. With the journal clutched tight and a determination to uncover Eleanor's truth, I left the attic and returned to the living room. My hands still shook as I sat at the dining table, surrounded by documents and clippings that painted a tragic tapestry of love, betrayal, and loss spanning over a century. The storm raged on outside, but within me, a quiet resolve took root. I spent hours piecing together Eleanor's story from scraps of old records, family anecdotes long buried under time, and the raw confessions of a heartache so deep it echoed in every creak of my home. I learned that she had been silenced by those who feared her scandalous beauty and fierce passion, a woman whose memory was deliberately erased. It seemed the house itself had been complicit in keeping her secret hidden, only now demanding that someone acknowledge the truth. By the time dawn broke, pale light streamed through the windows, and the oppressive atmosphere began to recede. I had gathered enough evidence to honor her memory. I printed out clippings, transcribed parts of the old diary passages, and even made a promise to myself to share her story with anyone who would listen. As I set my things in order, I felt one last, soft whisper brush past my ear, a gentle thank you, or perhaps a plea for forgiveness, echoing in the quiet morning air. Even now, as I write these words in the safety of daylight, I can't shake the lingering presence of that night. I still hear faint footsteps in the attic on stormy evenings. Sometimes I catch myself glancing upward, wondering if Eleanor's gaze still follows me, silently urging me to remember her story, and the haunting truth that every home, every old relic, carries the weight of forgotten souls. I've since moved on and left that house behind, but the memory of that night remains etched into my very being. In our modern lives, we often dismiss the quiet spaces of our past, the dark corners of memory. But sometimes, in the stillness of a stormy night, when the only sound is that of a lonesome heartbeat and the soft thumps from above, we are reminded that everything has a history. And sometimes, what watches from the attic is not here to harm us. It is here to be remembered. I will carry Eleanor's story with me always, as a reminder to honor every lost voice and to listen closely to the whispers in the dark. For in remembering, we might just set the restless souls free, and in doing so, perhaps finally find peace for ourselves. The watching in the attic is my testament to the eerie truth that even in our solitude, the past will always find a way to reach us. And as long as there are secrets hidden in the rafters, someone, somewhere, is watching. It started with a glimpse. I was tidying up in the dim light of my apartment one chilly autumn evening when I noticed something strange in my bedroom mirror. At first, I assumed it was my tired eyes playing tricks on me. I had been working long hours at a job that drained every bit of my spirit, and I was hardly surprised when my vision blurred at the edges. But when I looked a second time, I saw that the reflection wasn't quite right. The face looking back wasn't entirely mine. There was a subtle distortion, a flicker of another presence lurking behind the contours of my own expression. That night, as I lay in bed with insomnia tugging at my sanity, I couldn't stop replaying that unnerving vision in my mind. I had inherited the mirror from my grandmother, a beautiful, antique piece with a carved wooden frame that told tales of old-world charm and mystery. It was something I'd always admired in family photos, an heirloom that spoke of generations past. But that night, it seemed less like a cherished relic and more like a window into an alternate reality. The following morning, determined to understand what I'd seen, I sat down in front of the mirror. I adjusted the lighting, fumbled with my phone to record a video, and even tried to gently wipe the glass, half expecting smudges to be the culprit. Yet nothing changed. My reflection appeared perfectly normal for a few seconds. Then, when I paused, I caught a fleeting image of a pale, gaunt face hovering just over my shoulder in the reflection, its eyes dark and sorrowful. I whipped around immediately, heart pounding, yet the room was empty. I told myself it must have been a trick of the light, the result of exhaustion. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that the mirror held secrets I was not meant to see. Over the next few nights, the odd occurrences escalated. I would catch glimpses of the figure whenever I wasn't paying full attention, at the corner of my eye, reflected in a window, or in the wavering image of my computer screen. One particularly restless night, I lay awake staring at the mirror. The familiar comfort of my reflection was gone, replaced by a stranger. My eyes met eyes that weren't entirely my own, features that seemed to blur the line between my identity and something unknown. The face in the mirror was intermittently overlaid with faint images, shadows of a long-forgotten sorrow, hints of a life I never lived but somehow recognized. It was as if the mirror held a portal to another existence. I began to research my family history in an attempt to uncover any mention of a cursed heirloom or ghostly phenomena linked to that mirror. My grandmother's journals, yellowed with time, spoke of peculiar dreams and mysterious visitations, but nothing explicit about the mirror itself. Still, she mentioned a vengeful-looking glass in passing, a term that chilled me to the core when I saw it written in her spidery hand. I combed through old letters, searching for any clue that might connect the dots. At times, sleep evaded me for nights on end, replaced with mind-racking anxieties and a persistent feeling of being watched. One evening, Overwhelmed by a mix of dread and determination, I decided that confronting this phenomenon head-on was my only option. I set up cameras around my room to monitor every angle of the mirror. The first night of recording was uneventful. The footage showed nothing but my solitary, restless sleep and the ordinary ambience of a quiet apartment. But on the second night, something extraordinary happened. I awoke at 3:17 a.m., heart galloping, to the sound of soft scratching coming from behind the mirror. My eyes struggled to adjust in the darkness as I fumbled for my flashlight. When I shone its beam on the glass, I noticed faint, ghostly traces that looked like handprints scratched into the surface. They were too shallow to be real damage, yet they pulsed with a strange luminosity, as if alive. The following days became a blur of investigation and paranoia. I rewatched the footage repeatedly. In one segment, I saw the mirror's surface ripple as if disturbed by invisible fingers. My own reflection lagged behind my every movement, a slow, eerie delay. In another clip, the camera captured an entire sequence where my reflection's eyes darkened dramatically, and in one frame, I could swear the reflection was not mimicking my movements at all. Instead, it seemed to act independently, its head slowly tilting as though it were surveying me with an intelligence that was not mine. The more I watched, the more I began to believe that my mirror was more than just a piece of antique glass. It had become a conduit for something beyond ordinary comprehension. Sleep became a distant memory. The relentless horror of the mirror plagued my waking hours and taunted my nightmares. I tried to cover it up with a heavy blanket to hide from the unsettling visions it invoked, but that only seemed to worsen my isolation. Every time I removed the covering, the mirror greeted me with the unnerving possibility that something was waiting, something that was not me, but was an echo of me, an alternate version contorted by sorrow and regret. Desperation led me to confide in a close friend, Mark, whose rational mind had always been my anchor. He listened carefully as I described every detail, the inexplicable delays, the ghostly handprints, and the disembodied expressions. Mark suggested that stress and sleep deprivation might be amplifying my imagination, urging me to get help. I attempted to explain that it wasn't just my mind playing tricks. The evidence on the footage was irrefutable, but his skeptical eyes left me questioning if I was truly losing grip on reality. I began to wonder if I was experiencing a form of psychosis. However, one particular incident shattered that thought completely. One stormy, pitch-black night, I awoke to find the mirror completely dark. Not a trace of my face, nor any reflection of the room, only an impenetrable void. Panic surged through me. I fumbled to turn on all the lights, yet nothing changed. Slowly, as I sat terrified before this endless blackness, a movement caught my eye. From within that void emerged a shadow, a dark, wraith-like shape that approached with a deliberate slowness. It wasn't until the figure was nearly upon me that I saw the faintest glimmer in its eyes. They pulsed with an otherworldly light that made my blood run cold. I wanted to scream, to run, but I was paralyzed by the relentless grip of fear. The shadow lingered, examining me with a silent intensity that spoke of centuries of despair. Then, just as silently, it receded back into the darkness, leaving the mirror as empty as if nothing had ever been there. The next morning, drenched in sweat and shaking uncontrollably, I forced myself to confront the mirror once more. I could no longer ignore what I had seen. I began an exhaustive documentation process, scribbling down every detail in a journal, noting the exact times of occurrences, and describing the ghostly features with painstaking precision. I even attempted to capture the moment using different cameras and settings, hoping that technology might offer an explanation. But each attempt only deepened the mystery. The mirror began to change its behavior subtly. On some days, it would show a flicker of a face from behind me. On others, it would seem to swell with a dark energy that pulsed in sync with the rhythm of my heartbeat. One particularly dismal afternoon, while leafing through the margins of my grandmother's old journals, I discovered an entry that chilled me to the core. The entry described a ritual of remembrance, a way for a restless spirit to communicate with the living. It mentioned that if a family heirloom, especially a mirror, did not reflect one's true self, it was because it was absorbing the soul of someone who was lost and yet still tethered to that world. According to the diary, the mirror would gradually reveal the image of the departed if the current occupant paid close attention. I felt as though each word was addressed to me, a warning or perhaps an explanation. Had this mirror been cursed long before it came into my possession? Was it possible that by merely gazing upon it, I was inadvertently inviting a lost soul into my life? The thought both fascinated and terrified me. Driven by a morbid curiosity and a desperate need for answers, I began to experiment. I stood before the mirror day after day, trying various rituals I found in the margins of old occult books, lighting candles in a circle around it, reciting spoken affirmations of remembrance, and even leaving objects that belonged to my family as offerings. In the quiet moments after these rituals, I sometimes caught fleeting glances of a face that wasn't mine, a young woman with sorrowful eyes and a faint smile of resignation. Her presence was neither malevolent nor protective. It was as though she existed solely to be acknowledged, to be remembered. As the weeks turned into a blur of sleepless nights and feverish investigations, I found myself becoming increasingly detached from who I had once been. My reflection, or rather the lack of it, became a daily torment. I would stand for hours in front of the mirror, watching as the comforting image of my own face wavered, replaced over and over with that mysterious, spectral visage. There were moments of eerie clarity when I almost believed the mirror was trying to tell me its story, a tale of loss, betrayal, and an unfulfilled promise that stretched back generations. I began to piece together fragments of a tragedy. A young woman named Isabella, whose life had been cut tragically short in a fire that consumed an old estate, leaving behind only whispers and scraps of her spirit trapped within the mirror. One night, emboldened by a sudden surge of determination, I addressed the mirror directly. "Who are you?" I demanded in a trembling voice. The silence that followed was heavy, laden with innumerable unspoken words. Then, in a voice that was not my own, but resonated as if from deep within a forgotten grave, the mirror replied, "I am she you lost. I am the one whose memory you dare not forget." The voice was sorrowful and ancient, echoing off the walls of my mind. It sent a shiver of both fear and pity through me. I felt tears streaming down my cheeks as I whispered back, "I will remember. I promise I will never forget." From that moment, the mirror's behavior changed ever so slightly. While it continued to play tricks on my mind in the dead of night, the spectral images became less erratic. There was a quiet rhythm to them now, a mournful cadence that spoke of deep, unending regret rather than pure malice. I began to understand that the mirror was not a monster to be vanquished. It was a relic filled with memories, a conduit for a lost soul desperate for acknowledgement. In its silent, reflective depths lay the ghost of a life abruptly ended, waiting for someone to listen, to remember, and perhaps to set it free. I dedicated myself to uncovering Isabella's story. I pored over county records, old newspapers, and family letters that had been tucked away in dusty attics. Over months of painstaking research, I assembled a mosaic of her life, a young woman of beauty and passion, whose life had been marred by misfortune, scandal, and ultimately an untimely death in a fire rumored to have been no mere accident. Every clue I unearthed deepened my connection to her, and with every new fact, I felt the mirror's presence grow stronger, more resolute in its silent plea for remembrance. Some nights, as I sat alone in the flickering candlelight, I would feel her presence like a gentle caress, a reminder that Isabella's spirit was now a part of me. I began to see her not as a haunting specter, but as a tragic figure whose story demanded to be told. I created a small scrapbook filled with clippings, personal letters, and carefully transcribed interviews with people who remembered the old estate. I wrote down everything I discovered, and in the quiet spaces between my frantic research and weary sleep, I talked to her as if she were present, a conversation between a solitary soul and one lost in the annals of forgotten time. One particularly stormy night, when the wind howled like a chorus of morning voices and rain battered the windows of my apartment, I made one last attempt to commune with the mirror. I arranged the items I had gathered, a faded photograph of Isabella in her youth, a weathered locket that had once belonged to her, and an old letter expressing her final, desperate hopes. I sat before the mirror, now illuminated solely by the erratic dance of lightning outside, and spoke softly. I have not forgotten you, Isabella. I promise your story will be heard. I will remember you, even if the world has long since cast you aside. For several agonizing minutes, the silence held me captive. Then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, the mirror's surface shimmered, and in that fleeting moment, I saw not my own face, but Isabella's. The sorrow in her eyes mingled with a gratitude so palpable it nearly moved me to tears. In that mystical exchange, I felt the crushing weight of decades of neglect and heartache lift ever so slightly. The mirror had served its purpose, not to terrify, but to remind me of the fragility of memory and the importance of bearing witness. And so, as dawn broke over a rain-soaked cityscape, I vowed to honor her legacy. I compiled everything I had learned into a small manuscript, a chronicle of her life and the dark secrets that had bound her to that cursed mirror. I shared her story on forums, in local historical societies, even with acquaintances who had once dismissed my ramblings as mere paranoia. Gradually, her tale began to take on a life of its own, a bittersweet blend of tragedy and remembrance that resonated with all who heard it. Now, years later, I still live with the echo of Isabella's sorrow. The mirror remains in my bedroom, a constant, silent witness to my efforts to remember. And sometimes, on quiet nights, as I lie awake and gaze into its depths, I see her smile, a small, fleeting expression of peace, as if finally freed from the shackles of a tragic past. I know that I carry a responsibility, not just to myself, but to all those lost souls whose stories are bound to the objects we inherit. The mirror that once failed to reflect me now reflects something more, a shared humanity, a connection between past and present, a reminder that in the silent corners of our lives, memory and loss often walk hand in hand. As the seasons change and I grow older, the terror of that mirror has transformed into a profound sense of duty. I have learned that even the most unnerving phenomena can hold within them a message of hope and redemption. Isabella's spirit, once trapped by the cruelty of fate, now lingers as a gentle reminder that we must never forget the stories of those who have been erased by time. In every scratch on the glass, in every fleeting flicker of shadow, there is a whisper urging us to remember, to acknowledge the beauty and tragedy of lives that once burned so brightly. I often wonder if others have experienced similar encounters with heirlooms or artifacts that bridge the gap between the living and the dead. Perhaps, in some quiet attic or forgotten room, there exists another mirror that does not simply reflect one's image, but offers a passage into hidden histories. For me, Isabella's mirror has become a daily meditation, a source of both terror and solace. And as I continue to care for it and keep her story alive through my writing and research, I take comfort in the realization that even in the darkest reflections, there can be light, if only we dare to remember. The mirror that didn't reflect me is my testament to the intricate tapestry of memory, loss, and the indomitable human spirit. In a world that often forgets too quickly, the most haunted mirrors may well be those that hold the faces of the forgotten. And if you ever find yourself facing a mirror that seems not to reflect you at all, pause for a moment, listen to its silent language, and remember that sometimes the past reaches out for acknowledgement in the most unexpected ways. I've always prided myself on being able to enjoy solitude. After years of living with roommates and noisy families, the silence of an empty house was almost a balm to my soul. I had finally moved into a small, old townhouse on the edge of a quiet suburb, a place with creaky wooden floors, long hallways, and a history that whispered through every corner. For the first few weeks, I reveled in the quiet nights and the freedom of having the entire house to myself. But there was something strange about the house, a persistent, unsettling sound that only emerged when the moon was high and the world outside was in deep slumber. I remember that particular night vividly. It was the kind of night that made you wonder if you'd made a mistake leaving the warmth of a crowded apartment for the eerie isolation of an old building. I had just finished reading a book in my favorite recliner when a noise, so subtle at first that I almost dismissed it, caught my attention. It sounded like soft footsteps echoing down the hall. At first, I tried to rationalize it. Perhaps the house was settling, or maybe the wind had pushed a loose shutter. But as the sound continued, slow, deliberate, and impossibly measured, I couldn't ignore it. I sat motionless, straining to hear any further detail. The sound came again, a gentle, rhythmic thud, followed by another, then the faintest whisper of a creak. I pressed my hand against my chest as a cold dread began to coil in my gut. I recalled the countless nights of silence that had made this house my sanctuary, and now it was as if the quiet had been invaded by a presence I couldn't quite name. Steeling myself, I rose from my chair and crept toward the hallway. I kept my hand on the wall, letting the cold, rough texture ground me as I advanced. Each step was an act of will, a defiance of the growing terror that screamed at me to run. The hallway stretched long and narrow before me, lined with faded wallpaper and pictures of people I'd never met, the previous occupants whose lives were interred in this aged space. With each measured step I took, the sound of the footsteps grew a little louder, as if echoing my own anxiety. As I reached the middle of the hall, I paused. The soft footsteps had halted right outside a closed door at the far end, a door I hadn't paid much attention to since moving in. It was an unassuming door with peeling paint and a tarnished knob that rattled slightly whenever the wind caught it. But tonight, it stood out in a way that pricked my every instinct. Something was behind it, something that didn't belong to the familiar creaks of an old house settling into winter. I blinked, wondering if my eyes were deceiving me in the dark. The house was supposed to be empty, and yet the sound, those footsteps, had a deliberate rhythm that no natural creak could imitate. I squinted at the door, trying to catch any sign of movement through the narrow crack at the bottom. For a long, breathless moment, nothing happened. Then came another sound, a slow, deliberate thump, as if a heavy object had been set down gently on the floor. My heart began to hammer in my chest, urging me to retreat even as curiosity burrowed into my mind. "Hello?" I whispered, the word trembling as it escaped my lips. I expected an answer, even a slurred, ghostly echo. But the only response was a deep, resonant silence. Yet the silence was not empty. In it, I could almost hear the anticipation, a breath held in waiting, a secret that longed to be told. Not entirely satisfied with my unanswered plea, I took a step closer to the door, running my fingers along the faded brass knob as though it could transfer some warmth or reassurance. The metal was icy in my grip, and for a fleeting moment, I was certain I wasn't alone. In the stillness, the sound of my own heartbeat was deafening, each pulse echoing in the cavernous silence of the corridor. With a final, determined breath, I turned the knob slowly, half expecting it to creak open on its own. The door swung open with a long, mournful groan that sent shivers down my spine. Beyond was a narrow passageway that I had never noticed before, one that branched off from the main corridor and led into a part of the house shrouded in perpetual dusk. A thread of moonlight spilled in from a distant window at the end of the passage, illuminating only the edges of the room. I hesitated at its threshold, wondering if it would be better to ignore the summons altogether, but something compelled me forward. It was as if the footsteps had been guiding me here all along. I stepped into the passage, and the door closed silently behind me. In the low light, I realized that the walls here were different from those in the main corridor. They were adorned with old wallpaper and patterns that seemed strangely familiar, patterns I had seen in an old family album, perhaps belonging to one of the many lives this house had sheltered. Dust danced in the air, illuminated by the weak light, and every step stirred up memories of long-forgotten secrets. As I advanced slowly, my eyes caught the slightest movement at the edge of the light, a shadow, perhaps, that darted behind a rickety wooden door. My pulse quickened, and I pressed myself against the wall, heart pounding so fiercely I was sure it might burst. I strained to listen for any indication of another presence. Instead, I heard only the soft echo of my own breath and the residual patter of footsteps that had led me this far. I crept forward until I reached a small room at the end of the passage. The door, slightly ajar, beckoned me to peer inside. I pushed it open with trembling fingers, and what I saw made me freeze in place. The room was a forgotten relic, a narrow, cramped space that resembled a storage area or maybe a forgotten study. In the center stood an old wooden chair, its upholstery torn and faded. Scattered around, there were dusty books, faded photographs in ornate frames, and peculiar trinkets whose origins I couldn't decipher. But what caught my attention was a set of fresh footprints on the otherwise thick layer of dust. They were small, almost childlike, but unmistakably human. The footprints started at the door and led toward the far corner of the room, vanishing as if swallowed by shadows. My mind raced with questions. Who had left these footprints? Was it possible that someone else had been here this very night? I had been so careful, locking doors, checking the windows, ensuring that I was alone in this house. And yet, here were these undeniable marks of another presence. I crouched down, tracing the footprints with the tip of my finger. They were fresh, as if the person had been here only minutes ago. A chill spread through me, and I realized that I might not be the sole custodian of this house's secrets after all. I rose slowly, a mixture of dread and determination coursing through me. I could no longer ignore the sounds I had heard for weeks, the footsteps echoing in the hall, the mysterious thuds, and now the traces of someone unseen. Every whisper of sound in this corridor, every faint movement of the shadows seemed to coalesce into a single, haunting truth. I was not alone. I gathered my courage and decided to follow the trail of footprints. At first, the path was clear. They led directly from the small room back into the corridor, toward an area of the house I rarely visited. A narrow hallway that connected the living spaces to a series of closed rooms at the rear. The hallway was even more oppressive than the rest of the house, its walls marked with the remnants of old, scorched wallpaper and the persistent odor of decay that no open window could dispel. The footprints continued, this time appearing more erratic, almost frantic, as if the person had been running, desperate to escape or perhaps to hide from something. As I advanced down the hall, my mind began to conjure up images of horror movies I'd watched in my youth, images of children fleeing unseen terrors in abandoned houses, of spectral figures chasing after the living through dim corridors. The sound of the footsteps was growing louder here, clearer even, and I could swear I heard faint panting mixed in with them. My instinct screamed at me to turn back, yet an inexplicable curiosity bound my feet to the floor. I passed closed doors whose numbers I didn't remember from a standard house layout. Some were oddly labeled with faded symbols rather than numbers. The further I walked, the more I felt the oppressive weight of the house history pressing in on me. It was as though the walls themselves were imbued with the grief and terror of those who had once inhabited the spaces I now traversed. Then, as I reached the very end of the hallway, I noticed that the door at the far end was slightly ajar. A dim, flickering light spilled out from the gap, accompanied by the unmistakable sound of hurried footsteps, a staccato rhythm that made my skin crawl. I realized with a jolt that the footprints had led me directly here. With hands clenched in trepidation, I approached the door and peered inside. The room beyond was small, almost like a makeshift playroom, but with an atmosphere of profound neglect. In the center of the floor was an old, ornate rug, that had once been vibrant with pattern, but was now faded and torn. Near the rug stood a low table cluttered with dusty toys, a porcelain doll with cracked eyes, a set of worn-out crayons, and a framed photograph of a little girl whose smile had long since faded into melancholy. The presence here was palpable. The air felt heavy, as if every lingering regret and every sorrowful memory of the past had accumulated in this very space. I felt a pressure building in my chest. It was as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for me to unlock a secret that had been hidden for decades. In the far corner, I noticed a small, door-like recess built into the wall. It was nearly concealed by cobwebs and a tattered curtain, but I could see fresh scuff marks on its surface, evidence that someone had recently used it, perhaps in haste. Drawn by a mixture of terror and empathy, I moved closer. My footsteps were soft on the creaking wooden floor as I approached the recess. There was something disturbingly intimate about the marks here, as if someone had been hiding and then suddenly fled in a moment of sheer panic. I reached out and slowly pulled aside the curtain, its fabric soft and threadbare in my trembling hands. Behind it was a narrow doorway leading into a dark, almost suffocating space. I could make out the outline of another passage, one that was not accessible from the main parts of the house. This, I realized, was a secret section, a place the previous occupants had hidden away, perhaps for reasons I could no longer fathom. I hesitated, heart beating erratically, before gathering the resolve to step inside. The air grew colder as I passed through the doorway, and the sound of my own footsteps was muffled by layers of dust and silence. I reached the end of the passage and found myself in a tiny chamber filled with relics of a bygone era. Yellowed letters tied with brittle string, a rusted music box that still managed to produce a faint, melancholic tune when wound, and several faded portraits of individuals who looked as if they had once known unfathomable sorrow. One portrait in particular caught my eye, a woman with eyes that seemed to plead for salvation, her delicate features framed by curls that cascaded like an echo of lost time. On the back of the frame was a date, 1947. My mind raced with possibilities. Was this her? Had she been the one who once walked these halls, leaving footprints that I now followed? The intensity of the moment overwhelmed me, and I nearly collapsed under the weight of the unanswered questions and the haunting beauty of sorrow captured in faded paint. I sat down on a dusty, cold bench in the chamber and listened. The silence here was different. It was heavier, laden with unsaid words and broken promises. In the distance, I could faintly hear a soft murmur, like a voice reading a lullaby from another world. It wasn't a direct conversation, but a series of overlapping whispers, as if multiple souls were trying to share their stories all at once. I couldn't decipher the words, but I caught fragments: lost, forgotten, alone, and please remember. The realization struck me with a mix of horror and compassion. I was witnessing the echo of a profound, unspoken tragedy. The footsteps in the hall, the secret passageways, the hidden chamber, they all formed parts of a vast tapestry of sorrow and neglect. I began to understand that the house was not merely an empty shell, but rather a vessel containing the lingering presences of those who had suffered within its walls. Their traces were embedded in every scuff on the floor, every whisper of sound in the dark, every faded portrait left behind. I rose from the bench, determined to piece together this fragmented history. Clutching one of the yellowed letters in my hand, I tried to read the delicate, spidery handwriting. The letter spoke of heartbreak, of a promise to return that was never fulfilled. It hinted at secrets too dangerous to mention aloud. It mentioned a name repeatedly, Evelyn, and described a night full of regrets and unfinished farewells. I could barely make out the crumbling ink as I read, but the message was clear. Evelyn had been a soul lost in time, yearning for acknowledgement long after she had departed. The realization that I was not just being haunted, but was given a duty to remember those who had been forgotten settled over me like a mantle of bittersweet responsibility. The footsteps, that constant, deliberate cadence echoing in the halls of my home, were not meant to frighten me into isolation. They were a call to remember, a plea for resolution, and a testament to the power of memory. A sudden crash in the distance jolted me from my reverie. I startled and clutched the letter tightly to my chest, my eyes darting to the far end of the passage where darkness swallowed every detail. The sound was unmistakable, a heavy, echoing thud, as if something had been dropped or deliberately set in motion. I couldn't tell if it was a sign of danger or a clue to further unravel this mystery. Hesitantly, I moved toward the direction of the noise. As I stepped back into the narrow corridor, the old wooden floor groaned under my weight. Every step seemed punctuated by a new, disembodied sound, a shuffle of feet, the creak of old hinges, and even, at times, the subtle sigh of air moving through unseen cracks. I followed the path of these clues until I reached a long-forgotten part of the hallway that I hadn't explored before. There, the sound of footsteps was unmistakable, soft at first, then faster, almost hurried. They thumped along a worn-out carpet, echoing against walls decorated with peeling, ghostly wallpaper. I froze. The footsteps had become erratic, as if their owner was trying to escape or hide. In that moment, the silence of the house was shattered by a sudden, sharp cry, a sound that resonated not only in the halls but deep within me. I wasn't sure if it was my imagination or a real voice, but it had the quality of anguish, of calling out in desperation. Unable to ignore it, I pressed on, following the trail deeper into the labyrinth of dark corridors. At last, I arrived at a heavy, creaking door marked with a single, weathered number I didn't recognize. It was locked, but there were fresh scratches along its surface, evidence of someone or something desperately trying to force it open from the inside. With trembling fingers, I found an old key on a hook nearby, a key that should not have worked in this modern lock, yet somehow it fit. I inserted it slowly, every click of the tumblers echoing like a countdown. The door swung open with an eerie moan, revealing a spacious room that seemed to defy the rest of the building's decay. Here, a grand hallway stretched out, lined with mirrors that reflected not only my pale, terrified face, but also fleeting images of people who were not there. For a split second, I saw a little girl in a frilly dress, her eyes wide with fear, and a man with sorrow etched into his features, silently pleading. They vanished as quickly as they had appeared, leaving only a lingering chill. I stepped inside cautiously. The hall was decorated with remnants of past glories. An elegant chandelier that hung precariously from a high ceiling, portraits in gilded frames whose subjects seemed almost to watch my every move, and a thick red carpet that muffled the sound of my footsteps. Yet the most disturbing element was the sound, a series of gentle, measured footsteps that ran alongside mine, as though I were being followed by a silent companion. I reached out to touch one of the mirrors and saw not just my reflection, but the ghostly afterimage of a pair of feet following me behind. The reflection was slow, deliberate, a contrast to my hurried, trembling steps. I gasped and spun around, only to find the corridor empty. My pulse thundered as I realized I was caught in a disorienting interplay between past and present, memory and current terror. The atmosphere in the hall was suffocating, and every breath I took seemed to carry with it a whisper of the lives that had been lost here. I could almost hear fragments of conversation, of arguments and sobbing, as if the very walls were speaking of old tragedies and unfinished business. One particular murmur, a sorrowful cadence, repeated in my ears, "Come back, remember me." It was both a plea and an accusation, a demand that someone, anyone, acknowledge the forgotten souls whose stories were etched into the fabric of this place. I sank to my knees in the center of the hall, overwhelmed by the relentless procession of voices and footsteps that haunted me. The mansion seemed to breathe, its ancient heartbeat resonating in time with mine. I clutched the letter about Evelyn and let tears of both fear and compassion roll down my cheeks. I knew now that the footsteps through the hall were not malignant forces. They were the echoes of lives interrupted, of tragedies that had never been properly mourned. They were a call for remembrance, a desperate bid for closure that I alone was now burdened to answer. Determined not to let these restless echoes fade into the silence once more, I vowed to uncover the stories behind each faded footprint and whispered call. I began scouring the corridors for any scrap of evidence, old diaries, family records, news clippings stuck behind peeling wallpaper. Each discovery deepened the mystery and my connection to this house's tragic past. I found, for example, a brittle newspaper article from 1947 recounting the mysterious disappearance of a young woman named Evelyn, whose beauty and sorrow had captivated those around her until her abrupt vanishing. The article mentioned rumors of betrayal, of a scandal so shattering that her family had concealed everything, even going so far as to erase her memory from public records. As dawn began to edge its way into the hall, casting long, grim shadows across the floor, the echoing footsteps finally subsided. The house, heavy with its secrets, seemed to exhale, a long-held breath released slowly into the chilly morning air. I was left with more questions than answers, but I had learned that the very walls of this home carried the voices of those who needed to be remembered. I now live in a new place, far from that haunted townhouse. But on quiet, stormy nights, I sometimes lie awake wondering if I have truly left the echoes behind. I can still hear those gentle, deliberate footsteps in my mind, the steady, sorrowful cadence that once led me down long, dark corridors in search of lost souls. I carry with me the memory of Evelyn and the countless others whose tragedies whispered through the hall. Their voices remind me that every space, every home, holds stories that insist on being remembered, that even in absolute solitude, the past is never truly gone. I have written down every scrap of evidence, every note and photograph I managed to salvage. I have shared their stories in forums and local history groups, urging others to remember them too. For in the act of remembrance, the cold grip of abandonment loosens, and even the most lonely corridor can become a place of healing and tribute. So if you ever find yourself in an old house, alone in the silence of night, listen carefully to the sounds that echo through the hall. Not every step is meant to instill fear. Some are a plea for remembrance, a call to honor those long past. And when you hear those footsteps, take a moment to pause, to remember. For each echo is a reminder that even in solitude, we are never truly alone. Footsteps through the hall is my account of a night when the past reached out through the darkness, a reminder that every home, no matter how empty it might seem, is haunted by the echoes of lives once lived. I now know that the footsteps were not a threat, but a chorus of lost souls, each urging me, and perhaps you, to remember.